This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the show, at least at the outset, will have a slightly different feel today because we're doing one of those things where we break ranks, I say that, but gratifyingly, Newsnight is finally in the place where it should be. So we're breaking ranks with much of the UK media, but not all of it, thanks to the superb team of journalists at BBC Newsnight. Anybody who still watches that programme will be aware of what is on the horizon. Many people won't. In short, I presume from midnight on Wednesday, I presume it kicks in at 1 minute after midnight on February the 1st, we will be having non-tariff barriers on all food and drink or animal-based imports coming into this country, which rather gives the lie to this comment from just 4 years ago, almost to the day. I wonder whether you recognise the voice.
At this point, it's worth going back to what the former PM Boris Johnson said on the 24th of December 2020, after he signed that last-minute free trade deal with the EU.
There will be no palisade of tariffs on January the 1st, and there'll be no non-tariff barriers to trade.
So he was right that there would be no tariffs, taxes on imports, but wrong about the non-tariff barriers. That's precisely what these new import checks are.
And no one ever really thought that there would be tariffs, except, of course, the people who were telling you that WTO rules would be absolutely fine. I wonder if you can remember anybody doing that. Again, it is somebody with a rather recognisable voice. Here you go. This might jog your memory.
I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with it. It would have increased costs for people.
So, Jacob Rees-Mogg, not understanding that it is inevitable under World Trade Organisation rules. The basic facts are that you cannot have one regime in place unless you're in a customs union, brackets or a single market. I still get a little bit confused about that, but nobody's perfect. Unless you're in a customs union, you can't have one rule for one customer and another rule for another one. That is a basic premise, a basic requirement of the World Trade Organization. So this was inevitable. This was always going to happen. It had to happen. The temptation is, and this is where I think J-Dog lost the plot. The temptation is to think, well, let's not introduce any checks whatsoever. We'll just trust the European Union not to send any dodgy stuff over. So we'll have checks on stuff coming in from China, but we won't have any checks coming in on stuff coming in from France. And yet, of course, he has no choice in that matter. Now, with Rees-Mogg, and the reason I say it's a slightly odd show is that I presented Newsnight not long after Brexit went through. It was a fascinating period of my career where I felt increasingly lonely because I understood this stuff. That's not arrogance or conceit, or it's not even an opinion, it's just counting. I understood this stuff. And there were days when I was smashing my head against a brick wall, metaphorically speaking, wondering why we had to have guests who didn't. Wondering why, for example, if you had a guest who said that the world wasn't going to end on Tuesday, you also had to have a guest who would argue very passionately the world was going to end on Tuesday. And now, in the context of Brexit, Tuesday has arrived and the world has not ended. So all of those people who were arguing from a position of complete ignorance have been proved completely wrong. From the man who signed the deal, from the man who boasted about getting Brexit done, the man who looked you in the eye and told you there would be no non-tariff barriers on goods coming into Britain. The precise opposite is now happening. So when Victoria Derbyshire opened Newsnight last night, something that I've been waiting for the best part of a decade happened, and it was, in the context still of what the rest of the British media is doing, it was quite extraordinary.
It was Conservative Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg who promised cheaper food after Brexit. And it was former Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson who said there would be no extra checks on trade. It appears both were wrong. The day after tomorrow, post-Brexit checks begin to be brought in on certain produce coming to the country from the EU. Checks that have been delayed 5 times. And they will push up the domestic price of imported food. Such extra checks and charges, a move away from years of frictionless, free-flowing trade, became inevitable because of the shape of the Brexit deal agreed with the EU in 2020.
Now, this is extraordinary for a country to be indulging. We are, as a consequence of political imbecility and a grossly misled public, we are now making life considerably harder or measurably harder for anybody seeking to bring into this country anything from pork to sugared liquid eggs that are used in cake and sauces. There is a shortage of vets to sign the health certificates on the continent that are needed to send stuff here that is currently sent with no friction whatsoever. There's no trusted trader scheme. There's no clarity about what rules and regulations will apply. A system that is based on stuff arriving on a slow boat from China is going to be expected, as of Thursday morning, to deal with stuff that has hopped over the English Channel in a matter of minutes. That's not my opinion. That's Karen Goodburn, who's the Director General of the Chilled Food Association, representing some of the UK's biggest chilled food manufacturers. Physical inspection begins from the end of April. That will see European companies facing the pain of border bureaucracy for the first time since the trade deal came into force in January 2021. I genuinely, and the reason I say this has a slightly personal flavour for me today, is that I knew this day was coming. And I don't expect any sympathy. I'm certainly not expecting you to take out the world's smallest violin. But I took quite a lot of abuse for simply pointing this stuff out, for simply, on the rare occasions that I could get near somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg, simply highlighting that he didn't know what he was talking about. And then people who, I don't know why you were so certain he would be right about this stuff and I would be wrong, but you were really horrible to me, which is fine. It goes with the territory, it's par for the course. But where did that come from? Where did that idea come from, that I was being motivated by something unhealthy or unpleasant, and he was the one that was dedicated to telling you the truth, when the facts were bloody obvious? The simple requirements of World Trade Organization observations mean that you can't give France an easier ride on getting grub into this country than China gets. And therefore these tests, these checks, these barriers would have to come in. And then Johnson, building an entire Brexit. There were days when I thought I was going mad. I would sit here and listen, let's not beat about the bush. There were plenty of people who also sit in this chair who were saying the polar opposite of what reality made clear. It was a really weird period of my career, because I'd sit here and think, well, he's not stupid. She's not stupid. And they certainly don't lie to you deliberately, but they don't seem to understand any of this. They don't seem to have the barest grasp of what is actually going to happen. They're just taking the words of a proven liar like Boris Johnson, who would subsequently, of course, quit Parliament as a consequence of his lies, and a proven idiot like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who would end up as business secretary because they had to keep promoting the people who didn't understand anything. The alternative was reality. And you would hear people and read people who seem to have taken leave of their senses. And that's why there are days when you think it might be you that's gone a bit mad. You think maybe it's me that doesn't understand anything. I used to read you that quote from George Orwell all the time. Do you remember? There was truth and there was untruth. And if you clung to the truth, even against the whole world, you were not mad. Rees-Mogg would tell us that food will be cheaper. He categorically told us that food will be cheaper, and now it's going to be more expensive. Now, there are two things I want to do today. One, I don't know, you're probably too busy. You're probably too busy to give me a ring because you're trying to get ready for the changes that are coming in. But if you're not, if you can spare me a moment, if you work in agriculture, in food import, food export, if there are elements of what is unfolding this year that I'm not aware of or that I've missed, then you know what to do. 0345 60 60973 is the number that you need. There are a few corners of the British media still dedicated to telling you the truth, chiefly Newsnight, as I've mentioned, and the Financial Times. The Guardian picks up on the new border rules cutting the shelf life of fresh fruit from the continent by a fifth, leaving some deliveries unsaleable, because if you cut the shelf life by a fifth, you're not going to be able to sell it anymore. This is the SPS Certification Working Group, representing 30 bodies covering £100 billion worth of the UK's food supply. They say that requirements for importers to notify authorities a day before goods arrived in the UK were unfeasible and could mean some EU businesses stopping supply entirely. I don't know how many listeners I've got who are in the business of exporting food from the European Union into the United Kingdom, but if I'm lucky enough to have anybody in that category tuned in today, are you fully across what you're going to have to do? Are you fully clear about what is going to happen? This kicks in from April, this particular element of the new rules. And it strikes me that most people are utterly unaware. Yes, fish as well. We're supposed to have cheaper fish. It was supposed to be a good deal for fishermen. It strikes me that most people are completely unaware of what is set to happen. And that's where the second question comes in. And this is, I don't think this is childish. I think this is actually quite important. It's linked to history. And it is history. Historians will wrestle with this question. I'll play you those clips again of Johnson and Rees-Mogg, who have now been proved categorically wrong, not only about their understanding of what Brexit would involve, but about the detail and the ramifications of the deal that Boris Johnson won an entire election by lying about. Okay? So let's have Johnson first.
At this point, it's worth going back to what the former PM Boris Johnson said on the 24th of December 2020, after he signed that last-minute free trade deal with the EU.
There will be no palisade of tariffs on January the 1st, and there'll be no non-tariff barriers to trade.
So he was right that there would be no tariffs, taxes on imports, but wrong about the non-tariff barriers. That's precisely what these new import checks are.
Ben Chu on Newsnight there, I think, being very generous to Boris Johnson when he said that he was wrong about this. I think he was lying. Well, that's the question really, isn't it? Are these men deeply, deeply dishonest, or were they just profoundly ignorant of things about which they claimed to be experts? Here's Rees-Mogg.
I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with it. It would have increased costs for people.
Actually, yeah, a cabinet-level minister still not understanding the consequences of his own actions. It's extraordinary. So let's get the phone lines open. 60 minutes after 10 is the time. 0345 60 60973 is the number you need. Do you know what this is going to mean for you and for your business, for your livelihood? And the second question, which I would genuinely like you to join in on, because if you've been listening to this programme for some of the last few years, you're among the best qualified people in the country to answer this question. Rees-Mogg and Johnson, probably the biggest standard bearers for the disastrous Brexit that we ended up with. You're perfectly entitled to still believe there was an alternative that was better. A brilliant Brexit, just goes to a different school. But you take Rees-Mogg and Johnson, Rees-Mogg's entire reputation built upon that sort of jingoistic sabre rattling, which is an odd phenomenon, given that he doesn't look like he could lift up a sabre, never mind rattle one. And then Johnson promising this, promising that, promising the other, claiming he'd done it, claiming he'd delivered it, claiming it was oven ready, claiming it was brilliant. Now proven by events to be wrong. So I think there's different answers for each man, but you can go into as much detail as you want. You can do them separately, together. You can do them distinguish one from the other. But let's focus on those two in particular. There's plenty of others we could bring into it, like Ian Duncan Donuts and David Davis and all the rest of them, and Nadine Dorries, of course, who had to ask colleagues what the customs union was because she kept losing arguments about why it was a good idea to leave it. But let's focus on those two. Rees-Mogg and Johnson, do you think they were lying to the British public, or do you think they genuinely didn't understand what they were selling? Lying or ignorant? 0345 60 60973. Okay? I think it's a really important question. I think ignorance is probably more forgivable than deceit. I think you're probably allowed both, but I will want you to explain your working. Question number one, how is this going to affect you? 0345 60 60973. Question number two, the men who swore blind that this was not going to happen, the men who promised you that this was not going to happen, now that we know it's happening, do you think that they lied to you? Or that, for example, when Jacob Rees-Mogg appeared on this programme, he genuinely didn't understand what he was talking about? So are they ignorant or dishonest? Or a combination perhaps of both? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 10, a quick word from Mark, who's been in touch with a very, very persuasive bid to open Idiot's Corner this morning. He says, OMG, enough about Brexit, James. The majority of people are sick of hearing about it. Move on. Mark, mate, that's a bit like saying that if, for example, you had lost your keys and you couldn't get into your house, everybody who you were asking for help in getting into your house had moved on and was sick of you talking about it. It's the news, Mark. The news is that everything from sausages to liquid egg is now going to be requiring paperwork to come into this country when previously it didn't. The cost of your food will go up. Arne Mielken is the managing director of Customs Manager, a customs expert, and that is a trade facilitation business. And he has told the Financial Times, if you've ever been to Switzerland and wondered why everything is so expensive, welcome to what we have created here. So I fully understand why you don't want to hear about what you've done, but it's very important that you do. So even people like you need knowledge, need to benefit from a warning about what it is that you have brought upon the entire country. But listen, mate, I fully understand why you'd rather we didn't talk about it. Bad luck. 23 minutes after 10 is the time. Tom's in Maidstone to open the batting. Tom, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. I'm in the customs business. We import a lot of foodstuffs primarily from Europe. Everything from cheeses, pet foods, confectionery, right the way through to things like Kobe beef. These changes will have an impact. The ones which we're going to see at the end of this week will start to impact people like me primarily.
That's paperwork, is it? So paperwork this week, physical checks in April. Is that right?
That's correct. Right. Absolutely.
And at the moment, no paperwork at all.
At the moment, some paperwork.
Yeah, sorry. So prior to Brexit, no paperwork at all. So
no, there was no paperwork. There were no barriers. We were all part of the customs union. Now we are outside the customs union. We're a third country, and that means, therefore, that the sort of things which we saw in January 2021 when we first left for our exporters will start to occur for our importers. And the consequence, I think, will be that you'll see that small businesses will no longer do business in the UK because it will be just too costly and there won't be the margins in it for them.
And that is kind of what happened in the opposite direction, isn't it? We had, I always remember the fellow who ran the Cheshire Cheese Company and ended up, I think, selling it to someone who had hubs in Europe so they could take all the jobs and take all the trade into continental Europe. I find the conversation surreal, actually. The way, because you do this for a living, so you talk about it quite glibly. And I appreciate you wish it wasn't happening, but it is surreal that we are a country, an economy that has imposed trade barriers on itself.
Yeah. I mean, we are a very open economy, and we very much depend on foodstuffs. I mean, we only produce about 40% of our own food. So we are dependent upon Europe for a lot of the things which we see on our shelves on a day-to-day basis. And, without sounding off with Project Fear, what we will see will be that some of those things will take longer to get to the shelves. And as a result, there will be, certain shortages from time to time in certain categories of food.
And that means that some foods won't come at all because the difference between a just-in-time supply chain and a slow boat from China is absolutely enormous.
Yes, it is. I mean, what I would say is that from April, what we will see will be certain relaxations of the rules, which will allow local port area health authorities, which will be responsible for performing the inspections, they will be allowed to relax the lead time. At the moment, we're going to be going straight into 24 hours, one working day's notice, but it could go down to 4 hours, which obviously for short crossings, places like the Calais-Dover route or the Eurotunnel route makes a big difference because then some of the things which you talked about earlier on in the lead up, possibly won't be happening quite to the same extent as it would do if you had to put everything down 24 hours ahead.
But from April, the government will require importers to notify UK authorities at least a day before goods arrive at a border post.
That's what the regulations are saying, but there will be derogations.
Okay.
There will be certain freedoms and relaxations. So it will be down to the individual port health authorities. So it may be that you'll see a certain bit of pragmatism being introduced at that point.
Or risk. One man's pragmatism is another man's risk, because, you know, the more unchecked cargoes there are, the higher the likelihood of something dodgy getting in.
They won't be unchecked. I mean, the thing is that, again, risk categories apply here. So you'll have low-risk goods, which will be things which are shelf-stable, canned products.
Ambient.
Whereas you'll have medium risk, which will be open to physical checks and inspections. And they're talking about 1 in 3, perhaps. So there will be delays, and then there will be costs, because those inspections will have to be paid for.
It is extraordinary. I'm grateful for your expertise. I can't let you go without reminding you of the other question that's bubbling along this morning. People like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, you must have known when they spoke that they knew nothing, or that they were deliberately misleading the British public. Where would you put your money?
I would say that they were being economic with the truth.
It's very diplomatic of you. I would call them barefaced liars, or pant-wettingly ignorant, although I admit the possibility of both. I will answer that question myself this morning, but not yet, because I want to squeeze in another voice before the news. Tom, thank you, and good luck. Good luck. I've just gone a bit Yorkshire there. Good luck. And Sina is in Luton. And Sina, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James. First of all, congratulations for your programme.
Thank you.
It keeps me going every day.
Well, me too, actually, although I have no choice. You do. You don't have to listen. I have to turn up. Carry on.
I am an EU citizen,
yes,
and I have a business that I import Spanish food into the UK.
Right.
And the answer to your question regarding the politicians is they are liars, incompetent, and they don't have a clue. So that's a combination of everything. Pre-Brexit, we used to import. Everything was easy. We could get the goods here within a week from the moment we place the order to the moment they arrive here.
Yeah.
They will leave Spain on a Friday. They will arrive to my premises on a Monday.
What sort of stuff do you import, Encina?
All the good things from Spain. We import a charcuterie, quite premium charcuterie. You know, the best chorizo money can buy, cured beef, Iberico, olive oil. We import as well tin fish like anchovies, needlefish, tuna, that sort of things.
Yes.
We import. And is gradually, since the Brexit got implemented, it has been harder and harder and harder to get things in. Not last Christmas, the Christmas before, implementing new parts of the Brexit agreement for the fish, for the tin fish, which is got no danger whatsoever. And the amount of paperwork that we need for that is unbelievable. Unbelievable. And you cannot finish the paperwork. That's what is happening this week.
But Boris Johnson said there wouldn't be any paperwork.
Well, what actually really makes me angry was it will be no paperwork, free trade deal agreement. Yeah. It will cost you a maximum of £100 per invoice. That is a lie, because our invoices from the UK, they keep increasing. We don't pay. We started to pay something like £36. Now we get into 70, and for the fish we pay well over 100.
And you have to pass some of that on to your customer, and some of it you have to absorb yourself. I think that you're going to have bigger problems, aren't you, with the Iberico than you are with the tinned fish. Go on.
At the moment, we're having more problems in getting all the paperwork with the fish than we have with any of the meat products. But things are changing, so we are going to have problems with everything. And we're still not quite clear how much is it going to cost us. And also the incompetence in the British government to get things done is unbelievable.
Well, the only people who knew what they'd really agreed to are the same people who've done absolutely nothing to prepare the country for it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they either didn't understand what they'd agreed to, or if they were lying, they didn't care. And that's why I lean more towards lying than ignorance on both cases, because I think that they just said whatever suited them best, or they described in Jacob Rees-Mogg's case what they wanted to be true. And the British media never required them to prove that it was true. In fact, it treated people questioning whether it was true, abominably. And now here we are. All of the chickens are coming home to roost.
You're quite right there.
That makes my blood boil, Encina. It really does.
Tell me about it. This is absolutely crazy. But I actually don't think they actually know what they're talking about, because most of our cabinet, they come from the financial services. It's not the same importing and exporting services than it is physical things.
Yeah.
Like food. Food is high risk. It doesn't really matter in which form. You need to be very careful, and you need to protect the population. They don't understand. But I'm sure you've heard talking about all the big manufacturers, the Nissans and the Vauxhalls, how expensive it's going to be for us or for them to sell into Europe.
And yet they're still somehow banging it. You made me very late for the news, Encina. It's a compliment to how interested I was in what you had to say. Very, very briefly, how worried are you for your business now?
I am very worried,
sorry.
very worried, and we cannot export into Europe anymore. And pre-Brexit, we had a cake of 28 slices, and we could pick and choose. Now we have a very small cake.
A tiny little
small.
A tiny little cake. Thank you, Encina. I really am very late for the news, so my apologies for cutting you off. Thomas Watts is here now with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:36 is the time. It's like the old days, this, isn't it? Except that you can't deny what's in front of you now. You can't deny that when Boris Johnson, after signing his so-called deal, told you that there would be no tariff-free barriers to trade, he was wrong. That's the most generous possible analysis. I think he was lying. In fact, give me a moment. I'll be with Sarah and then Paul imminently. But briefly, I think they're different creatures, Rees-Mogg and Johnson, even though they're cut in some ways from similar cloth. They went to the same school, for example, although they had very different experiences there. I think that Rees-Mogg is a master of self-delusion. I can almost muster up some sympathy when I imagine the effort that he must have put into convincing himself that he was wise or intelligent. I mean, there's an awful lot of help in arriving at that conclusion if you're born with silver spoons in every orifice. But the idea in his own mind that the reason why perhaps his school days were so difficult was because he was of a superior breed to many of the people around him. And I think that actually protects you from some of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. But unfortunately, he brought it into public life. So that might be his personal protective mechanism, but he brought it into public life, and he honestly thought he understood these things better than the Director General of the World Trade Organization or actual import agents or anybody, really. I always remember Kieran, who always described himself as a van driver, but he understood. He could have lectured you for days on end about what was going to happen, and yet many people denied it. And now it is happening. So I think Rees-Mogg is a curious mixture of delusion and ignorance. I think he's got a very mediocre intellect, but an incredibly well-developed engine of delusion. And so in the same way that he convinces himself he's a superior breed, so he convinces himself that Britain will somehow thrive and flourish by removing itself from associations with foreign countries. So I don't think he ever stopped to work out whether what he was saying was true or not, because it was like an article of faith. In fact, let's remind ourselves of some of the things that he said. Let's start, of course, with I mean, possibly the stupidest thing he's ever said in public, although it's a very crowded field.
I would be in favour of a deal, but if that proves impossible, there is nothing to be fearful about leaving on WTO terms.
OK, and all the people that say there's a lot to be fearful of, like the National Farmers Union and the Governor of the Bank of England and the CBI, you can see what they can't see, which is...
Well, the CBI's got everything wrong in its history. It wanted us to join the euro, wanted us to join the exchange rate mechanism.
I think that's what you just called a red herring or something, isn't it? So the question is, what can you see that they can't see?
What I would say is that you should judge people by their previous track record.
Well, I am. Why haven't you taken down that tweet from The Sun about what tariffs really means? Because The Sun withdrew it and it's still on your Twitter account, so I'm judging you by your track record.
Right. Judge away. The Governor of the Bank of England said we'd have a technical resection. Thank you so much. Fortunately, you're not a part of the judiciary. The Governor of the Bank of England said we would have a technical recession purely on a vote to leave.
The
that
question is, what can you see
wrong.
that they can't see? And you know that the Governor, I mean, this is so disingenuous. The Governor of the Bank of England dedicated himself on the morning after the vote to making his own predictions not come true. But you know this. You just know that if you say it in a plausible and persuasive fashion, people will continue to believe you, despite the fact that you've led them to the precipice of a no-deal Brexit, which even you know deep down will be disastrous. Unless you can answer this question. What is it you can see that they can't?
You're trying to get up to the adverts with an hysterical diatribe. I think
it's all right. We can postpone the adverts. What can you see that all of the people who warn against coming out with no deal can't see?
I can see what they've got wrong before and why.
I'm not asking about the past. I'm asking about the future. What can you see that they can't see?
The past is a very useful guide to the future because you can see why people are making the judgments. The CBI protects incumbent interests, and therefore it always goes for things that are not for the consumer interest but the producer interest.
Yes, okay.
The Governor of the Bank of England is a deeply politicised figure who has been anti-Brexit from the moment it was proposed. What can I see? I can see the opportunities of cheaper food, clothing and footwear, helping most of all the incomes of the least well-off in our society.
Absolutely nobody agrees with you.
Because we can cut tariffs, we can reduce costs to people.
Absolutely nobody agrees with you. Even the Sun newspaper withdrew these claims.
Exciting.
It's incredible listening back to that. I think I owe you an apology. I think I tried too hard to be equable. I should have torn his head off. I think I was still entertaining the possibility that I didn't understand stuff and he did. What a pathetic mistake that was, seriously. And check this out, when you don't have to endure my voice on this one.
In terms of improving people's standards of living, as you mentioned there, when you look at almost every major independent economic body and their predictions, when you listen to the Governor of the Bank of England, when you listen to people running major international companies, their view, and it's a prediction rather than fact, but their view is that it will decrease. A no-deal Brexit would decrease living standards, that employment would go down, the pound would go down even further. We'd have inflation, which would make it harder for people living on the breadline to buy food. The prediction is it would be a significant shock to the economy. We can't just dismiss what all of those bodies and all of those people say, can we?
Well, dismiss is perhaps a harsh word, but we can look at the fact that they've been completely wrong since 2016 and they've made all these absurd forecasts over and over again.
The pound is crashing, though.
The Governor of the Bank of England said there would be a technical recession merely on a vote to leave the European Union. That was wrong. We didn't have one. The economy has grown. Currently, there are economic headwinds, but these aren't to do with Brexit. These are to do with a slowdown in continental Europe and a slowdown in China, which have an important effect on us. But the way we can improve people's standard of living is once we take charge of our own tariffs, we can reduce tariffs on food, clothing and footwear, and that improves people's standard of living very directly and helps the least well-off in society at the most. It's a really exciting opportunity.
Extraordinary. And listen, you know, I'm cursed with this need to see the best in people. Maybe not him. But you know, if you were one of the people sending abuse to me after that interview, I think you can still see people on YouTube, not that interview, the one that I did, still see people on YouTube going, ha ha ha, O'Brien got owned. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't a game of football. It was a battle between truth and lies. And he lied to you. Or he was too stupid to understand what he was talking about. And another very good example of that, of course, in the news today. And finally, it looks as if the Northern Ireland Assembly is returning to work, Northern Ireland effectively without any devolved government at all for months and months and months, as a direct consequence of a Brexit that Jacob Rees-Mogg said would have no impact whatsoever on Northern Ireland. And understanding it was really simple. You needed to understand that the Good Friday Agreement hinges upon there being no substantive difference on either side of where the border used to be. Life had to be the same. Trade had to be the same. Rules had to be the same. You needed to have regulatory alignment. But again, because the actual words regulatory alignment didn't appear in the Good Friday Agreement, like a sort of a very mediocre sixth former in a debating society, he thought that was a powerful point. And yet here we are today, celebrating news almost 8 years after Brexit, celebrating news that they may have come to an arrangement that allows the island of Ireland to accommodate the insanity of Brexit. So here he is on the Good Friday Agreement.
Talking about the withdrawal agreement,
yes,
it is a Remainers Brexit.
What does that mean?
It means that it's shadowing membership of the European Union. It's half in, half out. That it would tie us into the common external tariff. It would tie us in via Northern Ireland to the EU's rule book in vast swathes of activity.
And when people warned that the Good Friday Agreement would render that inevitable, why do you think they were dismissed?
Because it doesn't.
So regulatory alignment isn't in the Good Friday Agreement?
No, it isn't.
Okay. It is.
No, it isn't. It's not a matter of the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement wasn't considering those sorts of issues.
You don't think the Good Friday Agreement insists on regulatory alignment on both sides of the Irish border?
No, it doesn't.
What do you do now? What do you do? Literally, in Thomas's news bulletin, we're reporting upon a resolution of the problem he just denied existed. 8 years. 8 years after Brexit, and God knows how many years since that interview. 5 years, I think, almost to the day since that interview. Go on YouTube, have a look at all the people who still bought his snake oil, still buying it last month. And yet now, it is literally like arguing that the world is going to end on Tuesday, and it's now Wednesday. So what do you do with your loyalty to the person who told you that the world was going to end yesterday? It is actually Tuesday. I should have chosen my words a little better there. It's like arguing that the world was going to end yesterday, and it's now today. And he's there. He's still getting, paid by one of these weird new television stations. I can't remember which one. I think it's the Rupert Murdoch one, is it? Or is it the other one? Anyway, it doesn't matter, does it? Because they exist to keep these lies alive. And I was motivated throughout by a deep belief that you deserved the truth. And now you've got it.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
I don't know which is the most remarkable of those memories of Jacob, the greatest hits of Jacob Rees-Mogg, every single one of which has now turned out to be either a demonstration of epic ignorance or a blatant lie, or a combination of both. I've got some more for you, but I think we'll take some calls first, because we also want to know the impact of the tariff-free barriers that the British government is compelled to introduce tomorrow night, and then more come April. Despite the fact that people like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg swore to you that nothing of the kind could possibly happen. Jules is in Upton on 7. Jules, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, James, amazing listening back to that lot.
What does it do? Does it make you want to tear your own hair out or his?
I haven't got much hair to tear out.
No, nor me, actually.
If I did, I'd be shaving it off in fury. But I think, and it's amazing, isn't it? You listened to him and he said something like, the past is a fantastic predictor of the future. Yes. But his past is in 1850, I mean, we've got scurvy and rickets back, and I'm just off home later to pick the weevils out of my biscuits.
He's only half joking.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yes, correct. Half joke, whole earnest. But yeah, look, I think these things, we talked about this in the past, haven't we? I work with food
import and export.
Food imports,
yeah.
Exactly. And so we have a company in Italy. I've got an example of where this thing is really sort of live and real. On Friday, I was with a client up in the Midlands who also imports. And in the course of the conversation with them, there's a particular tinned meat product, which we are the distributors of in Germany. So our Italian company, we have a German subsidiary. It's a very big brand, actually, and a lot of Italian people would know it,
okay,
and they want to buy it.
Yeah.
Okay. And you'll find it in every deli, every wholesaler, every online shop, and so on and so on. As a throwaway thing, this guy said, I really want to get that product. And the importer, so there was one kind of key guy, has just stopped importing it because it's too complicated.
Gosh.
Really interesting. And I said, that's interesting. Tell me more about that, knowing that we did this. And basically, because they all buy in relatively small volumes, although the value is quite high, the amount of paperwork that's now going to be required, you're going to need a veterinary certificate for that product because it's in a can for every batch of that
And there's
product.
A shortage of vets.
There's a shortage of vets. Well, there aren't a shortage of vets in Italy. You can get it certified there. That's not a problem.
There are in some other European countries. You might be right about Italy, but I don't know if you are, actually. I mean, it's typical me, isn't it, lecturing you on your own livelihood. But the Italian Agribusiness Association, Coldiretti, has said it was definitely concerned about the flat charge coming in on all products, whether they were inspected or not.
Yes,
but maybe it was the Germans that were worried about the shortage of vets rather than the Italians. No,
well,
my bad.
Actually, that's a good point, because we would actually move it from Germany. So
yes.
we would have to. But anyway, apart from that, aside from that, I looked at that and thought, well, okay, we did some consolidation during Brexit for another one of our clients, where we absorbed a lot of their import business because they were dealing with lots of smaller importers. We had to set up a UK limited company, so there's a whole load of cost involved with that, just to satisfy the labelling requirements, which were shelved twice. We had to redo all of our packaging, and we carry about 200 lines just to get our address on it.
Wow.
In order for it to be legally sold in the UK. That actually eventually did come in January, but we did that too. We absorbed that cost 2 years ago. So that precluded a whole bunch of people from importing. And then in this particular instance, we looked at, or maybe we could consolidate that again. And the net effect of that is that if we are able to sort of cobble this deal together with this particular brand owner, who we will see at some point this week, what does it mean? It means that for us, the benefit is that we can scoop up a lot of that volume and then service these customers, okay? So in one way, we'd say, well, that's a benefit for us because we can bolt that on. But then we have the infrastructure to cope.
So you're because you're a bigger player, you're in a better position.
Yeah, the parent company is a larger player and has that infrastructure. But what does that mean? If I look at that sort of from the helicopter and say, well, is this good or bad? Well, okay, I might on the one hand say, well, all right, that's kind of okay for us.
Yeah.
Fair enough, right? But actually for the industry, is it great? No, of course it isn't, because what will happen is invariably people like us who might be able to do that cannot service everybody.
No.
There will still be volume issues. And some of those smaller importers it's their livelihood at the end of the day, and they're a very, key component of the ecosystem of this industry, are just going to drop off the perch. And if you couple that with the import charge that's going to come in, I think it's October, if I'm not mistaken.
So unless you are a big operator, or you can somehow get under the wings of a big operator, then you could well be tostada.
Exactly. So basically it's going to consolidate. It's going to do a little bit, it's like trickle-up commerce, I suppose. It's like when you look at what's happened to society over the last 25 years, particularly the last 15 years, it's more and more wealth concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer and fewer people. And in business, it's kind of going the same way. And I think that's a real shame when you look at the really successful economies.
But it's very unconservative as well, isn't it? It's supposed to be the sort of party of entrepreneurship and business. And I know Boris Johnson rather gave the lie to that, but it's bad for. It's also unpatriotic. It's bad for everybody.
It's bad for everybody.
One point we've missed.
There are very few people who will benefit, and the degree to which some people like us, a business like ours, might benefit is quite small. But I look at it and say, actually, I prefer that the country's doing fantastically well, because then I can create stuff elsewhere. Whereas smaller businesses are going to really struggle to do that.
Hang on. I don't want to run out of time, but when you hear those clips, and I've got another one coming now, where they both said with their full chest that there will be no tariff-free barriers, for example, and any intelligent reading of what was on the table, it would have delivered the conclusion that, well, there's going to have to be. Mm. What do you feel? And I'll ask you the simplistic question. Do you think they were lying, or do you think they just were too ignorant to know what they were talking about?
I think it's willful ignorance.
Ignorance.
I don't think they had any clue. None. They've never been in a commercial business in their lives.
We didn't need to be, nor have I, but I just listen to people like you.
Yeah, I know, but you'll listen to expertise. If you've got someone on the other side of the table who says, I've had enough of experts, it's like me going to my financial advisor and saying, what should I do with my pension? And he tells me, and I go, you're just an idiot, you're just an expert.
I'll stick it on a horse. I'll stick it on a horse.
Exactly, put it on a horse, yeah. So I think they were just willfully ignorant. And
it's a good phrase.
You can interpret that as they were just making it up as they went along, and look what's happened. I mean, I'll leave you with this one thought.
Go on.
And I love this quote, and it is, there are none as blind as those who cannot see. And they just couldn't see what they were doing. What
they were blinded by may have been slightly different. In Johnson's case, I think it was ambition, and in Rees-Mogg's case, I think it was a curious sort of 19th century jingoism, a rule Britannia waves the rules sort of mindset. But my God, in a normal country, they would be held to account, wouldn't they? As it is, of course, Boris Johnson's been rewarded with a column in the Daily Mail, and Jacob Rees-Mogg has been given a television programme. That's how this country works. That is the media ecosystem in which the madness could happen. Absolutely extraordinary. A media ecosystem that even promotes and rewards people like the lad from Lewis who wasn't Lewis, who had a bit of a comeuppance in court yesterday, which we may find some time to talk about shortly. Thank you, Jules. Sarah's in High Wycombe. Sarah, what would you like to say?
James, I think that the reason Johnson and Rees-Mogg got it so epically wrong on Brexit and non-tariff barriers, it's not that they're lying nor that they're ignorant. I think what it is they're such narcissists, they're so egocentric that they think any situation they've got, the right thing to do is what's right for them. So that's why they jumped on the whole Brexit bandwagon in the first place. And then they expect the world, this is from their schooling, they expect the world to rearrange itself to suit them. So when you say to somebody like Rees-Mogg, non-tariff barriers, he just doesn't hear it. Because
do you think he knows what it means?
I think he doesn't care.
Yeah, so you're
really,
describing
really
the impossibility of people who don't have these psychological flaws, understanding people who do.
But I think the really devastating thing about this is the effects of it. So they've made this gamble that has come from their egocentric personality.
Yes.
But they're totally insulated from the effects of it. So they're not going to be eating poor quality food because now high quality food has got even more expensive. The people who are really going to suffer from this are children in schools like mine. So I teach in a school in a deprived area.
Yes.
And already we've got children who are obese because their parents can only afford biscuits. We've got tooth decay.
Yes.
We've got our school dinners are poor quality food. So what is the upshot of all these decisions by people like Rees-Mogg and the prices increasing and it being harder to get in fresh food? So
when he said that, when he said cheap shoes for peasants, and he said that poor people will be able to have cheaper food, was he was he lying to win their votes, or did he believe it himself because he's so stupid?
I think what he thought was we would just remove all barriers. I mean, that's what Patrick Minford was about, wasn't it? It's like we wouldn't protect any of our own industries. We just let the whole world sell stuff here. So it's true.
Kind of flavour of what Liz Truss tried to introduce, or where Liz Truss was coming from, and that went well. I think you're onto something there. I'm always slightly wary. Oh, I'm always very worthy. I'm always slightly wary of amateur diagnoses of personality disorders like narcissism. I know you weren't going all in on that, but if you're looking at someone and struggling to understand how they could have done something so wrong, so stupid, so spectacularly and obviously bad, you perhaps do reach eventually for psychology instead of knowledge. I'm minded to stay with this, with a side order of Stormont, with a side order of what's happening in Northern Ireland, something else that Jacob Rees-Mogg either lied about or completely failed to understand. I appreciate that this is unlikely to happen, but if you were one of his little followers, how are you feeling today? You're welcome to ring me and say sorry.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. So, listen, it's a bit self-aggrandising, and I appreciate that's not a good look, but I don't know how to avoid it on a day like today. We got it right back in the day, and it is now being proved right. So you could cling to the notion that it was that Jacob Rees-Mogg knew what he was talking about. You could cling to the notion that Boris Johnson knew what he was talking about. And just to go back to Mark, who was an early arrival in Idiot's Corner this morning, begging us to stop talking about it. I'm not sure what the alternative is. Obviously, we can't stop talking about it for reasons that Jules and Encina and plenty of other people have highlighted perfectly. The flow of food into this country is likely to be disrupted, and the cost of the food that gets here is certain to rise. The ramifications of that are almost endless. For example, the government's own figures in, I think, October of last year. So the paperwork alone would add £330 million to business costs. Just the paperwork alone. That's presuming they press ahead with it. That's presuming that trade doesn't diminish. If it carries on, it costs businesses £330 million more, and that puts 0.2% on inflation over 3 years. Now, Rishi Sunak stands up and makes speeches about bringing inflation down, while the Brexit he supported will actively and measurably increase inflation, according to his government's own figures, right? The patrician drawl of Jacob Rees-Mogg speaking utter gibberish highlights many things, not least the snobbery that's endemic in this country. If he had an accent like Angela Rayner's, he wouldn't have got away with half of what he got away with among the sort of forelock-tugging, cap-doffing sections of the population. The news from Northern Ireland today proving that those of us who said this is going to have a terrible impact, there's going to be all sorts of issues in Northern Ireland if you don't take into account the importance of regulatory alignment on the island of Ireland, being proved categorically and completely correct. So we kind of led the field. I know that sounds boastful, but if you were here, you'll know that it's true. We kind of led the field on this stuff back in the day, with 1-2 fingers behind my back all the time, crossed, hoping that things wouldn't be as bad as I thought they were going to be, because I live here and I love living here, and I've never really wanted to live anywhere else. And now we've reached the point where it's "I told you so" time. Although we don't use the phrase "I told you so" on this programme, because we introduced a feature whereby I had to put £1 in a tin every time I said it, and Keith was close to retiring as a millionaire at one point. So I thought we were supposed to give it to charity. No, the Keith Benevolent Fund. And so now it's coming back round again, and I get Mark's point. I get why you would not want to talk about it. So I'm going to look briefly at the alternatives. Here's someone called David Charlwood who says it's Remainers like you that frustrated Brexit negotiations and have held the country back since. I mean, there's no point putting people like David in Idiot's Corner, because Idiot's Corner is supposed to give you space to reflect upon your idiocy, and some people are too stupid to realise how stupid they are. But if you're sitting there today thinking, well, it could have all gone brilliantly if it wasn't for the people who described reality. There are no circumstances in which you could leave the single market and not have tariff-free barriers in place for stuff coming into this country. It was technically impossible. But it's all the fault of Remainers. Boris Johnson told you that he had an oven-ready deal and that he'd got Brexit done. And we're now seeing the consequences of his deal. But the reason why it's rubbish is the fault of the people who told you that his deal wouldn't do any of the things he promised it would do. It's just extraordinary. So either you don't want to talk about it, or you don't want to hear about it, or you're clinging to the notion that there is a good Brexit, it just went to a different school. Or what? I mean, what's the other alternative? I don't know. How else do you cling to it? And the Jacob Rees-Mogg fan club, didn't they even give themselves a nickname? Did they call themselves Moggies or something like that? I don't know what you do in circumstances like this. What do you do when it turns out someone you've bet your country's future on didn't understand what they were talking about or was deliberately lying to you? I genuinely don't know. And you know, lest anybody thinks I'm exaggerating, I've got all the receipts.
In 2017, 44% of UK exports went to the EU. 53% of all UK imports came from the EU. New trade deals with other countries will take years to sign. They will not compensate for our loss of trade with our biggest trade partner.
Well, what loss of trade?
Well, because if we put tariffs up and costs go up, and we put barriers in, and we lose just-in-time transporting, you know, we're putting up massive obstacles.
But why are we going to put up these obstacles?
Because you're suggesting we come off a cliff edge on the 29th and we don't have a deal.
I'm sorry to say this is all complete invention. There is no reason for the British to put any obstacles to imports from the European Union when we leave. None at all. No tariffs, no non-tariff barriers. Indeed, it's an opportunity to reduce tariffs and tariff barriers against the rest of the world, cutting the cost of imports from the rest of the world, which are very often more competitive than those coming from the European Union. So it's a really exciting opportunity for us. And you're assuming, if I may say so, that the government would decide to punish the UK for leaving. Why would any government do that?
Because of World Trade Organization rules. Because you cannot have one import regime in place for one trading partner and a different one for another one, unless, of course, you're members of a single market or a customs union. I mean, there's no pleasure in this, is there? I thought it might be more fun. This sort of lap of honour type territory, but we live here. And, of course, the less money you've got, the more negative the effects of what Jacob Rees-Mogg has done to the country will be. In fact, it was Sarah, wasn't it, reflecting upon the underprivileged children in the school where she teaches and the dietary options that are open to children like those.
I've been to Australia and eaten Australian beef quite happily.
I'm sure you have, but why does the European Union regulation outlaw hormone-treated beef?
Oh, because it's protectionist and it wants us to pay higher prices.
So it's got nothing to do with hormones?
No, it's the EU is a protectionist racket.
So we can buy the EU is a protectionist racket.
It is,
of
yes.
Course
it protects inefficient European producers at the expense of British
so we'll be
consumers.
buying hormone-treated beef from Australia and we won't be checking it at our ports to make sure that it's okay, because Australia will have told us that it's okay.
Australia has I trust Australian standards just as much as I trust Irish standards.
Yes, but Ireland don't give hormones to their beef cattle.
Well, I'm not worried about that. I think that
Can I ask what your qualifications are in the context of humans consuming hormone-treated beef?
Well, that it's perfectly safe in Australia, and the Australians don't have any ill effects from this.
Right. You've researched this, have you, Jacob?
That seems quite a good enough answer.
No, it doesn't.
I think
the research on what hormone-treated beef is believed to do to human beings is quite capacious. That's why they can sell it more cheap, because it makes the stuff grow in an unhealthy fashion.
I think you're just running along with a hobby horse, actually.
I think you're right, Jacob. Soil Association, of course, describes some of the hormones used in treating beef, 6 commonly used in US beef production, which, of course, would be part of any trade deal that we did with them as being a complete carcinogen. But, he knows best. And some people listened to that and thought that he did, which I think I will always find extraordinary. They thought that he did. 11 minutes after 11 is the time. So is he incredibly stupid or incredibly dishonest or a curious combination of both? Peter is in Oxford. Peter, what do you think?
Hello, James. Yeah, a couple of things on that. First of all, I'm glad you're covering this, although it's painful to hear.
It is painful to hear. But it's actually extraordinary to hear as well, because it's as if the reality of what happened is even madder than my memories.
I know. In terms of Rees-Mogg, I don't think anyone's ever got rich out of betting on Rees-Mogg's intelligence. And I think we have to give him the benefit of the doubt. But in case of Boris Johnson, absolutely, he's lying. First of all, I knew him as my local MP. He's highly plausible. He tells people what they want to hear. That's his go-to position. And he's done so many times. And bear in mind, I'm not an economist. I don't know much about the intricacies. I watched the broadcast on Christmas Eve 2020, just before the TCA was finalised. And I knew with certainty that when Boris Johnson said there would be no trade barriers, he was telling something that wasn't the truth. And I find it very hard to believe that he actually thought that this could be true. He talked about non-trade barriers very explicitly, as you played. It was very clear in the TCA, and presumably, although he obviously didn't read it, he must have known something about what was in it, and David Frost would have told him. But to go back a year previously, go back to the the Northern Ireland Protocol. He told his backbenchers essentially that he had signed it in bad faith.
Yes.
We've had several people telling us that afterwards. So we know that when you
We'll undo it afterwards. We'll undo it afterwards. And that's what's led to the political stasis in Northern Ireland.
He was being deliberately mendacious on that.
Yes, he was.
So he was doing exactly the same thing. There's no reason to suppose for 1 second that he was being dishonest in 2019 and was being honest in 2020. There's no way about that. I think the Newsnight broadcast is a step in the right direction. Newsnight has been, including in your day, of course, as a member of the team, but it's always been one of the more open BBC programs. But the interesting thing is that BBC management are now trying to clamp down. They're shortening it and reducing its capacity to do investigative journalism.
Robbie Gibb, Theresa May's former Director of Communications, who still hasn't answered all of Alan Rusbridger's questions about an allegation from Nadine Dorries, of all people, that had behaved in a profoundly underhand manner trying to get his chosen candidate into the chairmanship of the BBC, has taken to lecturing Newsnight staff on impartiality. I'll say that again. Theresa May's former Director of Communications, who was put on the board of the BBC by Boris Johnson, has taken to lecturing Newsnight staff about impartiality.
Well, people need to know this. And the fact is that...
Luckily, there's a book, Peter.
BBC, I know. But people, when I wrote to the BBC about this, I got their standard response. And of course, they parroted back that, Newsnight presenters were good people and they'd be better off doing a talk show. than doing serious investigations. I said, I think this is going to bring Newsnight down to the standard of Question Time.
Which suits them down to the ground, of course.
Which is the kind of program the BBC love, and of course the difference between Newsnight and Question Time couldn't be greater. Just one final point, though, which I was going to come back to. Your comment about a good Brexit. Some people obviously phone in and say it's a Remainers Brexit. Anybody who thought, knowing this generation of Tory politicians, that you could trust them to use discretion and wisdom and honesty in negotiating the Brexit deal and in what happened afterwards, any person who believed that to be the case would have been a fool.
I've used very rude words describing the leaders of the movement. I can be rude about the followers, but I do try to remind myself of the importance of retaining contempt for the con men and compassion for the conned. I think that's expired now. I think, if you're still clinging in like David Charlwood here, or David in Charlwood, I'm not sure whether there's a comma missing. It's Remainers like you that frustrated Brexit negotiations. I think the best analogy just dropped a moment ago. Imagine telling someone that they're driving too fast. They ignore you and crash. And then they climb out of the wreckage and shout at you, "It's your fault for telling me I was driving too fast." That is what's happening. And there's not a lot of it in my inbox, I have to be honest with you. And that perhaps is a positive, a sign of improvement, a glimmer of hope.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 19 minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we're sort of indulging ourselves a little bit this morning, albeit with a distinct lack of schadenfreude or pleasure. We're looking at reality and comparing it to what was promised chiefly by Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg in the context of Brexit. I don't know, apart from this ludicrous notion that you had your Brexit somehow ruined by the people who had no power over it whatsoever, and the people who had all the power, like Boris Johnson, messed up because I don't know what. I don't know how. I mean, what's the second chapter of that defence? Remainers like you frustrated Brexit negotiations. Boris Johnson had a majority of 80. He got rid of almost all the talent in the Tory party, in the parliamentary Tory party, in order to force through legislation that anybody honest knew was rubbish. But some people were too stupid to realise it was rubbish, and some people were too ambitious to tell the truth. The 30 or 40 odd MPs that were neither of those things got thrown out of the actual party. I remember Philip Hammond going from Chancellor of the Exchequer to deselection by his own constituency party in the space of weeks. Extraordinary, really, when you think about it. And they were right. And the people who won were wrong. But how does the conversation evolve now? 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. I don't know what you do. You have to talk about it because, it's going to increase inflation. It's going to increase trade. I don't have any hope at all of seeing the architects of the catastrophe held to account. I don't think Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg anytime soon are going to be setting up a GoFundMe account to cover their household bills. We have created a country in which lying and sabotaging on that scale actually gets rewarded. The Daily Mail announced Boris Johnson as a new columnist within hours of him of him running away from the House of Commons, running away from Parliament itself rather than actually account for his own misdeeds and lies. And here's a reward. Here's a fat contract. Rees-Mogg being proved categorically and completely wrong about everything, rewarded by Rupert Murdoch with a lucrative job on the telly. The mind boggles really at how that operates and how that works. But here we are. So I'm not holding out for that. I'm holding out for normal people recognising the idiocy of what we've done. And I don't know how you build bridges if they still need building. I think the rejoin figure is up to 61% now. Of the people that want to stay out, how many of them are headbangers? How many of them have got gammon for brains? I don't know. Usually, I think the Reform Party, I can remember now which is which because of the lad from Lewis who wasn't Lewis getting his arse spanked in the libel courts yesterday. The the Reform Party's on about 10, 11%. That's roughly the pop. But there'll be some Tory supporters who've got gammon for brains as well. So you're looking usually at 15 to 20% of the electorate who really shouldn't be allowed near scissors. Farage's people. But apart from them, how do you build bridges with people who must now know that this is madness? I don't know. And of course, Sunak was a Leaver as well, and yet he is going to be in Downing Street when the non-tariff barriers are put in place. All of the Brexiters promised there wouldn't be any. It's extraordinary. 23 minutes after 11 is the time. So 2 questions. Number 1, how's it going to affect you? 0345 6060 973. And number 2, were they lying or were they stupid? Because I don't think Johnson's stupid. But what happened? How could a country, let's broaden it out now from those 2 characters, those 2 charlatans, how could a country end up thinking, or a majority end up thinking, that Nadine Dorries and Andrea Leadsom had a better grasp of the facts than, for example, Mark Carney and Gordon Brown? I mean, extraordinary. I use them as examples because they beeped on my radar quite loudly for a number of reasons. But you could bring in Mark Francois and Jacob Rees-Mogg, or Mark Francois and David Davis. How could what happened to our country now that it's Tuesday and all of the people that told you the world was going to end on Monday have got egg on their face? Not that they'd ever admit it, or if they have, it's because a Remainer put it there. It is madness. And those clips, if you're just tuning in, I may treat you to another run through some of them. The clips demonstrating Johnson's utter failure to understand the inevitable consequences of his own deal. It's not normal. This is not a normal country. And almost all of the media is still kind of in their camp. Almost all of the print media is still kind of in their camp. 24 minutes after 11 is the time. Dan's in New Cross. Dan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
I think you raised a really good point. You asked the question there, what happened? And I mean, I'm going to sound really A-level politics here.
Well, it's several levels higher than Jacob Rees-Mogg.
But it's capitalism. And why did The Sun publish those headlines about Hillsborough that weren't true? Because they thought they could sell more copies. So, it's a different logic. It's a different existence. You speak with empathy. I like to think I speak and think about empathy, and they don't.
But I mean, it's capitalism in one sense, as in it was good for business. These lies were good for business. But it's anti-capitalism in another sense, in that it's very bad for the country's business. It's bad for the economy. It increases inflation. It increases business costs. These are enemies of capitalism.
Yeah, but
they're enemies of the pursuit of profit, a lot of the things that they've done.
If they're still at the top of the pile, though, that's what matters, and they can still export that. They will still be doing the dinner talks. They'll still be...
there's no argument there. They'll still be... I don't know, I may have got it wrong. It may not be Murdoch's station where Rees-Mogg does his funky stuff. It may be the other one, the Faragey one. I'm not sure. I don't care. But you're right, they get rewarded. Lying or stupid or something else. I know you've mentioned capitalism, but that still involves understanding how they could stand there and say things that everybody informed knew to be untrue.
I think they're honest. I think they're honest to what they've been trained in, their products. People invest in them from an early age, even their parents sending them to these places where they get trained in this outcome. So, their product, I think they're honest to the product, and an ISA or an investment, you sort of want to see where it goes, what the outcome is, and if the outcome is to get the top reward at the end of it, then I kind of think they're doing the right thing with what they've been trained to do. And then you look at television and we go home, and because the other interesting thing that you said was about why do we get behind it,
yes.
not us, but and we go home, we watch The Apprentice, we watch Traitors. we're sort of like conditioned to get behind this.
It's a game show. It's only a game show. Everything's a game show. Yeah, it's a bleak analysis of your fellow man, but it fits most of the available facts, Dan, and perhaps there is something in it. More like footballification, actually, as I've always called it. It's as if once you've got your scarf around your neck, it doesn't matter what's happening on the pitch. You know damn well who is in the right and who is in the wrong. If your defender breaks both legs of the opposition striker, it's his own fault for running too fast. Which brings us back to our friend blaming Remainers for Brexit being rubbish, doesn't it? It's your fault. You were running too fast. So when I tackled you, obviously both your legs broke. But there's no earthly way that our defender deserves a red card for that. So what happens now? Because you don't really get that in football. You can carry on long after the football is finished, claiming that the referee was an idiot or that your team deserved to win or that VAR has robbed you of the FA Cup. But now, the cult made a promise, and the promise has been broken. The world did not end at 4 minutes past 12 yesterday afternoon, and they swore blind that it would. They said there will be no tariff-free barriers, and they're coming in at a rate of knots. They're coming in fast. So what do you do? How do you process that? Blaming it on the people who told you it was going to happen? It's an option, but it must be a pretty dismal, pitiful, shameful place in which to find yourself. Or what? And of course, as I told you would happen, by the time the chickens came home to roost, all the people who delivered them have sailed off over the horizon. At least the big cheeses have. Sunak voted for it. Liz Truss didn't. So make of that what you will. Luan is in Reading. Luan, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
Thanks for having me. Well, I enjoy listening to your show, especially for Brexit.
Well, we don't do it much anymore, but I've got a feeling it's going to start popping up again quite regularly.
Yeah. And I read all your books are perfect read.
Thank you.
Just want to... Well, James, I think ignorance and lying, especially in the second question, they come together. Ignorance comes from stupidity. So people, I think, they try to... first they try to lie, but they try to make day-to-day things. If tomorrow it's different things, then they just adjust it or they change their position, and people believe basically what they were saying.
Because they want to. So we've probably missed something, haven't we, which was the desperation to detach from an institution in which we were senior partners with lots of foreign countries. I think people like Rees-Mogg really objected to the idea of us walking in unison with foreign countries, and a lot of the people who ended up falling for his spiel probably felt the same, and that almost crowded out logic and knowledge and intelligence.
Yeah. Well, I blame you for not turning his head off.
Yes, I take that, and I apologise. I just gave him lots of rope, and no one noticed that he'd hanged himself. Well, lots of people did notice, but not his fans.
Yeah. During that period before Brexit, I was asking lots of people about why you voting for Brexit and why this. And one guy, he said to me, "Oh, I'm voting Brexit because it's FIFA, football FIFA."
Right.
I said, "Why? Why is that?" He said, they're doing some wrong things and against England, and so I'm just voting for Brexit.
Oh, my days. Even I didn't get that one. That's up there with the fellow who voted to leave the European Union because he'd heard that they were going to abolish 3-pin plugs, or the lady who rang in to say she'd voted for Brexit because she wanted to wrap her fish and chips in old newspapers again. They walk among us. Luan, thank you. The time is 11:31. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
25 minutes to 12 is the time. Quite a few of you remember my clips better than I do. I'm not doing requests today. I mean, maybe I should please play the clip of the fisherman saying it's as simple as that. That's from Guy in Torquay. That wasn't one of mine. I think I used it as a clip, but it wasn't a clip from my own programme. We could perhaps... It's too hard to do requests because we'd have to have like a jukebox of clips from the programme. I suppose the ones that were clipped up and put online would be quite easy to... But we're not doing that today anyway. It occurred to me listening to Thomas's news bulletin that in the middle of a conversation about Brexit, that if the British political establishment or the English political establishment had a better understanding of Northern Irish politics, not least the fine detail of the Good Friday Agreement, then the Brexit debate would have unfolded in a very different fashion. One of the few people to realise the ramifications it would have leaving the European Union would have on the Belfast Agreement was Theresa May, actually, in the run-up to the vote, but she never mentioned it afterwards, which is significant. And is part of the reason why you've had 2 years of political stagnation in Belfast, which appears to be coming to an end, which again does two things. It focuses the mind on what the future might look like, and it reminds us of how wrong people like Jacob Rees-Mogg were in the past. Alison Morris is a columnist on the Belfast Telegraph. She's also their crime correspondent, although I don't think you'll be wearing that hat during this conversation, Alison. What's happened?
Well, I mean, I actually admire your optimism that you think that if they'd have understood the politics of Northern Ireland, that they might have been more sympathetic. I'm not sure they would have.
No, fair point.
As we know, Brexit was a pursuit and certain people's self-interest. But yeah, because unionists obviously have major objections to both the protocol and the later Windsor framework, in that they say it made Northern Ireland a place apart. We have different trading arrangements, and there was checks in place for goods that were travelling from Britain into Northern Ireland, because obviously we have a land border with the EU single market, and those goods then could very easily make their way across into that and contaminate that. And so the EU wanted checks and balances in place. The DUP didn't like that, but also the legislation that was required for Brexit overruled the Acts of Union, something that sparked a very faint memory in my head of a long since past history lesson, and that they say secures Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. Look, in reality, the Good Friday Agreement says that Northern Ireland will remain part of the UK until the majority of people say otherwise. But the DUP wanted this change. They also wanted changes to the amount of EU law that Northern Ireland would still have to abide by. I don't think they've managed to achieve that as part of this deal. But they do say they've achieved changes to the Green Lane, so goods coming domestically from Britain into Northern Ireland. They've received changes to that, and they do say that there's going to be a statutory instrument laid down in Parliament which will give reassurances and restore legislation which mimics the Acts of Union, albeit it doesn't restore them. It's not everything that Jeffrey Donaldson, the DUP leader, would have wanted, but it's a pretty good compromise in terms of what many people thought he could achieve. Will it satisfy the hardliners in his own party? Definitely not.
You're asking my questions for me. You're asking my questions for me. That's exactly what I was about to ask you. But and secondly, as I'm sure you were about to address, taking their dissatisfaction on board, will that matter in getting it through and getting Stormont back in action?
Well, he came out last night. The meeting, first of all, was meant to be held in secret and private, and the location of that meeting was leaked online within about 20 minutes of people being told. At one stage, some of the senior party members were told where it was going to take place. It was in a very sort of rural place in the outskirts of Lisburn. Other members of that 130-member executive team were told to meet at a certain place, and then they were going to follow a convoy, which gave me flashbacks of sort of early 1990 raves. You know what I mean? Where you followed the car to where you were going.
Yes.
Although I don't think there was much raving going on at the DUP meeting.
No.
So there was already leaks coming out before then, and then they had the meeting, and all of a sudden we had this bizarre situation with the loyalist blogger Jamie Bryson, who's been on the sort of hard end of this in terms of the opposition to the Windsor framework, started live tweeting what was being said inside this seemingly private meeting. And it's, at one point Jeffrey Donaldson apparently, stopped the meeting and said, "We know that there's someone in this room leaking things out. Stop doing it, it's treacherous." And yet it continued on and it continued on. Now, given the fact that the press conference that was meant to take place at 10:30 didn't take place till 1 o'clock in the morning, I think there were some journalists quite grateful that this was being leaked out, because our deadlines were much earlier than 1 o'clock, and obviously the lines coming out of this, but it wasn't ideal for Jeffrey Donaldson. It shows that he certainly doesn't have his whole party on board. He might have managed to get it across, and we don't even know what that vote was. There was a secret ballot taken, and he hasn't said what the result of that was, other than that there was a vote in favour of it. So we don't know what the dissent is, but he still has a battle a day on his hands trying to convince those other people within the party, and his leadership is definitely damaged by this. Now, DUP leaders tend, apart from Peter Robinson, to make their way to the House of Lords, and that's where they usually spend their later days. That's where Nigel Dodds is, that's where Arlene Foster is. So maybe he has that in his sights, and getting this deal done is enough for him to move on.
Leave some of the ripple effects for a successor, whoever that may be. It does give the lie, doesn't it? The fact that he's got this far, it gives the lie to the idea, and I think your colleague Sam McBride was quite an early adopter of this position, that it wasn't as base as an objection to being deputy first minister in a government when the Sinn Féin leader was the first minister. Some of the coverage has suggested that was the biggest sticking block for Donaldson and his colleagues. This destroys that argument, I think.
Well, I'm not sure that it was ever a big issue for Jeffrey Donaldson, but it was certainly an issue for others within that party. Ian Paisley Jr., Sammy Wilson, Nigel Dodds. These people do not want the optics, even though they're joint roles. One can't even order stationery without the permission of the other.
It's deputy in name only. It's really a primus inter pares, isn't it? They are equal, but I take your point.
I think that the only difference is that when heads of state arrive, the First Minister gets to shake their hand first and the Deputy Minister second. But there's optics to that. Remember, this state, this place that I live, was only created just over 100 years ago, and the border was drawn in a very specific gerrymandered way to give it a unionist majority that was meant to last indefinitely, and it lasted less than 100 years. And so for unionists, that sort of loss of a majority, that loss of a unionist state for unionist people, that is now long gone. And we will see a Sinn Féin Deputy First Minister, not just a nationalist First Minister, a Republican First Minister, and someone who his active objection is to seek Irish unity. And they will use, obviously, that position and any other position they have to pursue that agenda. That's their All-Ireland agenda. They're quite open about that. That's what Sinn Féin want. And so for unionists who claim that since the Good Friday Agreement they've sort of lost again, it feeds into that narrative.
Yes.
But that is the change in demographics of this place. That is the change in nature of it. And it was always going to be so.
It is, yes. Trying to keep the tide out really was always thankless. But you mentioned unions. There is another one, of course, in this story, and that is the European Union, which needs to approve. The presumption is that they've given the nod to what Donaldson has pushed through, because they can, of course, as they've done before, conclude that the plans breach their terms and breach international law.
Well, that's the interesting part of it, because we were told the EU were done with this, but they're finished. Brexit's done. We've moved on. We want to hear no more about it. So there's two pieces of legislation being led in the House of Commons. The statutory instrument in terms of restoring Northern Ireland's place, that is literally symbolic. It doesn't mean anything because there was no threat to Northern Ireland's place. The other one is the legislation which will allow seamless trade on the Green Lane. That would have required EU approval. So clearly the EU have given a nod to that and said, look, we're not totally opposed to that. Will it be seamless? Will it be what Jeffrey Donaldson's promising? Will it be the business community? Will be able to tell us the realities of that once it kicks in. And also, we did have a time where Edwin Poots, a very former DUP leader, who was the Minister for Agriculture, he would have been in charge of, in that post, looking after those customs posts. They started calling them the detractors of the DUP, started calling them the Poots posts, which is not as easy to say as you might think. We're now told that part of these negotiations that he's going to be Speaker of the House.
We've done pretty well there. I think we lost the line right at the end with Alison, so some question marks still in place, but that deal that appears to, that has been done, should see a return to business for the Northern Ireland Assembly at Stormont. The political editor of the BBC, Chris Mason, puts it rather well. He says, but the word historic is the most overused word in a colossal bucket of overused journalistic vocabulary. But that word will be reasonable at that moment, the moment when they go back to power-sharing devolution. And he explains why. A party that dreams one day of a united Ireland in possession of the most senior job title in Northern Ireland politics. Quite a moment. Indeed it is. It's coming up to 11:45. A couple more calls on the question of what the new non-tariff barriers that Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson promised you would never happen. Perhaps, but I also have a guest waiting to talk to you who you have met before, Ghassan Abu-Sitta, a British plastic and reconstructive surgeon who was in Gaza, arrived in Gaza, coincidentally, for want of a better word, just days before the Hamas terror attack on Israel, and therefore found himself in the eye of that storm. And I said we'd catch up with him again, and we will after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:48 is the time. Some of us, most of us, if we can, I think, are minded to run away from catastrophe. Some people, and we are always fascinated by them on this programme, some people run towards it. It was on October the 9th of last year that Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittar made his way to Gaza under the banner of the Médecins Sans Frontières charity. He is an honorary professor at both Imperial College London and King's College London, and was the founding director at the Conflict Medicine Programme at the American University of Beirut. And Dr. Abu Sittar is with me now. You're a reconstructive and plastic surgeon. What do you do when you arrive in a place like Gaza after the bombardment has begun? You've done it many times. I know that you've worked in Syria, Iraq, Yemen. What do you do when you land, when you arrive? I'm sorry, that's a simple question, but I'm fascinated to know the answer.
So first of all, you get in touch with the local team, and you make yourself available according to their needs. As a result of doing this for now over 2 decades, usually as a result of the kind of experience and the expertise, I'm usually asked to stay in the operating room, and during this war was averaging between 10 and 12 surgeries per day. These are horrific blast injuries, shrapnel injuries and burns, and as a reconstructive surgeon you're trying to rebuild the human body after it's been so horrendously violated by these injuries.
And so you're hitting the ground running. You're in the operating theatre within hours, effectively, of landing in the region.
Absolutely.
How did what you found when you got to Gaza compare with what you discovered in previous engagements?
I think the difference is that between a flood and a tsunami. In previous wars, including Mosul and Yemen and Syria, they were vicious and intense, but you were in control and resources were limited but were not depleted. In Gaza, if you think about it, the whole total number of beds in Gaza is 2,500 beds before the war. At the moment, there are 60,000 wounded. So it kind of gives you an idea of how overwhelmed the system was. And so things were starting to run out very, very quickly just from the sheer number of the wounded. And
what sorts of things?
From the most basic, like antiseptic solutions to clean the wounds, to specialist dressings for burns, to certain stages, external fixators, pins and rods for fractures.
And a significant proportion of your patients were children, I think.
Half of the patients on a daily basis were kids.
On a human level, Ghassan, is that different? Is it different to have an infant patient to an adult patient, or is that a question only a non-doctor could ask?
Not at all. Actually, and I could chart how my experience in these wars was before I had my own children to after I had my own children.
Gosh.
As a parent, you just see your kids in each of these children. And it's a much more taxing experience. And I know from experience, unfortunately, that each war-wounded child will need between 8 and 12 surgeries by the time they're of adult age, because the body is trying to grow and the scarred, injured part of the body is unable to grow. And so they need repeated interventions throughout.
And presumably that's getting harder as the conflict continues. The capacity, the medical capacity is diminishing as the need is increasing.
Absolutely. The systematic targeting of the health system, the fact that now really there's one fully functioning tertiary hospital in the whole of the Gaza Strip, none in northern Gaza, means that, when I spoke to my colleagues who were there last, they had 400 patients needing surgery because they're unable to cope.
And what happens if they don't get it, or what happens the longer the delay? What's the impact of the delay?
Wounds become infected and they become life-threatening, and this is something that we had to face a lot during the war. What was possibly reconstructable becomes unreconstructable, and so limbs have to be amputated because of the delay. And I've had colleagues from MSF who are still there telling me that almost half of the amputations that they're doing now could have been fixed, could have been prevented had the patients been able to get to the operating rooms in time. And so you start what we call triaging. You start selecting what you can do and leaving others. And you start performing procedures that you could not imagine yourself performing without anesthetic, without morphine, because you don't have any anesthetic and morphine, but the infection, especially in children, within hours can kill the child. And so you end up having to take the patient, clean the wound, at least so you can buy some time, because if when you go around in the morning and the child is febrile and you can smell the infection coming through the dressings, unless you've cleaned that wound by the end of the day, that child is septic and probably dead.
I think you did 48 consecutive nights on duty,
yes.
Operating, as you said, 10 to 12 per shift. So what was it? Hospital sleep?
Literally, I would, at the end of the day, around 1 o'clock, we would clean the operating room, and I'd find one of the mattresses, wipe it down with some disinfectant and sleep there. And there were days when I wouldn't leave that room, So when you're trying to kind of think of events, I think of events more than dates, because these kind of would merge into each other.
And I think you survived an explosion at the second hospital you worked at Al Ali Hospital as well.
Yes. A missile hit the hospital. The roof, the false ceiling fell on top of us. And you were surrounded. I'd never experienced this, where you're suddenly surrounded by the wounded and you're in the midst of it, people who had just been injured, and you're trying to prioritize which patients to try to stop the bleeding at and resuscitate and take them to another hospital. It's probably one of the most difficult periods of my career.
I with that in mind, I wonder, and please don't answer this question if you don't want to, I wonder what you make of the way that the conflict is being covered in this country when you got back and saw the direction of reportage and the consequences perhaps of how difficult it is for journalists to get into Gaza and to get their stories out, and compare what perhaps the average British consumer of news believes to be happening with what you were in the middle of.
It's interesting. People now, especially younger people, seek their own news. They rarely, I can speak from my own children, they rarely watch the news. They don't watch TV, but they're informed because they're on social media looking for those outlets that they, and I think that's reflected by the support that there has been for a ceasefire. An immediate ceasefire, and the hundreds of thousands have come out in demonstrations, because people see. You see, I think we're at a junction here. This war, there are so many red lines that have been crossed, and that I think ordinary people recognize that if we don't apply international law now, regardless of the perpetrator, regardless of the victim, all of the consensus that had been reached after the Second World War to govern the conduct of wars, whether it's international humanitarian law or even the Convention on Genocide that's just come out in the International Court of Justice, then the next war will be much worse. Then it will be acceptable to target hospitals. It will be acceptable to kill 10,000 children in the first 100 days of the war. All of these red lines that have been crossed, we know that unfortunately, humanity has a way of starting where it ended in the last war, and any taboos that were broken. become the norm and become incorporated into military strategy. And I think that's one of the things that is bringing people out in droves.
Well, I think also when you refer to regardless of the perpetrator, you're alluding to the fact that the International Criminal Court is investigating alleged war crimes committed by Israel and Hamas.
Yes.
On both fronts. So you're describing almost the parameters moving, aren't you? The parameters of conflict reversing to a sort of pre-Geneva Convention type of scenario.
Absolutely. And so we have to go back to a rules-based world where it is the act that, just like the ICJ ruled on the war in the Ukraine and the genocide in Myanmar, Burma, it has produced a ruling on Israel and the plausibility that this is a genocidal war. And so political expediency has eroded the rule of international law until we got ourselves to this war. And this is the stand that we need to make, that regardless of political expediency, acts that violate international law have to be pursued vigorously in international courts.
What contact do you have when you get back with patients that you've treated, or how closely, because the chaos on the ground must make it impossible almost to keep proper track of how they are proceeding. In a previous interview you've given, you described a little girl with half of her face missing who had lost her entire family and the nail polish on her toes before they were amputated. It was impossible to read that and not be profoundly moved, but also impossible, I think, not to wonder what happened to her and whether you ever know.
I've not. I mean, people have had to move so many times. I've had to evacuate first at Shifa when that was surrounded with my patients, and then Al-Ahli when that ran out of medication. And time and again, people have had to relocate, and I've lost touch with so many of the wounded. And you always, in those moments where it catches up with you, you wonder what happened to these kids, and you know them, and you remember their names, and you remember their faces and their injuries, and you wish one day you'll be able to see them and find out what had happened. And that's why an immediate ceasefire is so important, that all of these injured children need to receive the treatment that they desperately need to be able to try to limit the kind of disability that they will live with for the rest of their lives.
Why do you do it?
I think it gives purpose to my life in a way other work doesn't. And it becomes a kind of almost like with each war, and then when I started pursuing this kind of work academically, you feel that you have more to offer, and you feel that you are obliged by this set of skills that you've been given, that you're obliged to be there because others will not be there. And so it, as painful as it is, it gives a wealth to my life that nothing else in my life has given wealth.
And in conclusion, the line that is used to describe what you're doing outside of the operating theatre and what you have done here today, it's a strange line, Ghassan, isn't it? You're calling for a re-establishment of the rules of war.
Absolutely. I mean, that's because having seen this erosion, we're here witnessing the complete destruction of the health system in Gaza because we tolerated it in Syria. We are here with over 12,000 children killed in Gaza because we tolerated it in Yemen. It's that continuous erosion that has gotten us as a global community, as a human race, to the point where unless we do stop, we will be back to pre-45 in the next war.
Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittar, many thanks indeed for your time today. It is 12:03.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
7 minutes after 12 is the time. It's a healthy impulse to want to protect the vulnerable. It's a weird one, though, because there's plenty of people in my line of work who have the opposite impulse. You see a headline like 1 in 9 children disabled amid rise in mental health problems, and you think, oh, that would be good to attack today. Let's go after these children. And the reason I know this is because I used to be one of these people. You might say something like, well, in my day, we were just called naughty. I used to say that out loud on the radio. ADHD, or whatever it's called. I literally used to say that out loud on the radio. And then I educated myself, partly through necessity, because of friends' children and godchildren, in fact, on this front. And you see, particularly in the case of ADHD, and OCD, actually, you see the absolute nightmare that it brings into a young person's life, the crippling consequences of neurodivergence. And you wonder how the hell you ever ended up being such a prat, frankly. I mean, it's good radio. Okay, mate, I can make you angry and you'll ring me and we can have a row. And I genuinely used to do that. I know I mention this occasionally, the things I used to do in what you might describe as a slightly more ignorant and predictable way as a radio phone-in presenter. Oh, look at the phones, they're ringing off the hook. I've just insulted everybody whose child has got ADHD. I've just called all your children liars. You're all swinging the lead, you're all taking the mickey, you're all doing it for the money. No such thing as ADHD. Do me a favour. Why has it gone up so much? Honestly, when I was a kid, you just got detention. And I used to use myself as an example. I'd say, well, I was a very disruptive child. I've never been diagnosed as having any particular neurodivergency, but it doesn't mean I haven't got one. However, I think if I do, it's fair to say that it hasn't compromised or limited my life in any meaningful or measurable ways. We talk next about children for whom it has. There are 2 elements to this story that interest me. The first is the link, the purported link between pandemic and diagnosis. The Times reports it quite responsibly, albeit that I already see the sort of the ghost of othering past coming up. I've said to you a few times, I wonder who they'll go for next. You can't really go for European Union immigrants anymore. You can't really go for single mothers anymore. You can't really go for... I mean, you can try to go for the unemployed, but universal credit is such thin gruel that you can't really claim anymore that people are signing on in order to live a life of indolent leisure with their flat-screen televisions and their 6-packs of special brew. I'm sure there are still some people out there who subscribe to those schools of thought, but the right-wing media in this country is on a constant quest for new targets or newish targets, and the only qualification to be a target is vulnerability. There are few people more vulnerable, for example, than refugees crossing the English Channel in boats, but they have got enormous targets painted on their back by Rupert Murdoch's media and politicians like Suella Braverman and the rest of them. Similarly, people who have long-term health problems that have rendered them unable to work. There will almost certainly be a handful or a small percentage of those people who are being economical with the actuality, and you use the fact that there might be some lead swingers on the list to malign all of them. And I mean, one of the oddest things about lockdown for me was the way that people who were working from home, it's sort of in the absence of more traditional targets for unpleasant, ignorant rhetoric to be directed at, they had to sort of come up with new ones. And it was, of course, partly sponsored by the interests of real estate developers and property owners, as people whose fortunes depend upon the trickle of money into their pockets because they had the wisdom to inherit a property empire or some such example. But it was extraordinary, wasn't it, how people who were working from home started getting spoken about with the same ignorant vitriol that's normally reserved for refugees or footballers taking the knee. They're not vulnerable, really, in many ways, although they're very rarely offered a chance to hit back. So I'm fascinated. You know that I'm fascinated, partly because I think I see myself as an antidote to this sort of public poison, which may be a little arrogant of me. But I'm always fascinated by who they're going to target next. Who's it going to be next? The list is long, isn't it? And ploddingly predictable. But I think when I said to you, when food banks had exploded, and I said to you, I think it's going to be hard to target the poor now. I think that so many people have got actual experience of poverty. I always ask people who ring in to share their own situations with me. I always say, if this was 10 years ago, and I mentioned someone like you, would you have believed me? And it's heartbreaking how many people have got the guts, actually, and the honesty to say, no, I used to believe that people were taking the mickey, James. I used to believe that it was all a lifestyle choice or this or that or the other, or that you just had to get a better job or start buying value products or, I don't know, cancelling your Netflix subscription. And then enough people now, because of austerity, have either experienced or been adjacent to poverty that the poor don't quite work as a target anymore. So I said to you, they'll go for the disabled next. They'll go for people who can't work. I didn't see this coming. Disabled children. That's today's target for a certain type of character. And I can say that with some understanding and experience because, to my shame, I used to be that type of character. I categorically did phone-ins, several phone-ins, on the subject of where did all these new conditions come from? In my day, you were just called naughty. I did until I was blue in the face. I think autism was probably the most offensive scenario in which I would adopt that position. And I'm very sorry about that. It's been years and years and years since I did it. And I'm sure that there are still some people in the British media that are still doing it. But the important questions attached to a story like this are twofold. The first is the classic question on this programme, what was it like? And I'm pretty sure the lad that asked that question was neurodivergent. See, that's the other thing that these people never admit. When they say, we just called it naughty in my day, that's not true. You called them thick. You called a dyslexic child was thick. They were made to feel that they were stupid. A child with ADHD was made to feel that they were feral or violent or wrong because they couldn't sit still. So that you didn't just call them naughty. You called them terrible things. You called them thick and worthless. You told them. You looked them in the eye and you told them they'd never amount to anything. And your frustration, if you were a teacher, was born of real issues. The fact that you couldn't control the class because there was a few children in it who couldn't control themselves. But we didn't just call you naughty, did we? We called you all sorts of horrible things. And anyone pretending that they only called you naughty is a liar. Because that's what neurodivergence is. It means you don't fit in. And you need different or special treatment. So I'm interested in the reality of what it is like. I'm almost interested in the question of how do you persuade old me that, I don't know, is that reasonable? How do you persuade old me that this is real? I see, I don't need any persuading. That feels like a show I could have had 6 years ago. It doesn't feel like a show I can have now because it's almost pandering to that level of performative ignorance that sees you saying things like, we just called it naughty in my day. I don't think we bring ourselves down to that level, do we? Today, what difference does a diagnosis make? 0345 6060 973. There's a question. What difference does a diagnosis make? And I'm interested in that from any level of life, from any age. I have been struck, both in my professional and personal life, by the number of adults who have sought a diagnosis after their child has been diagnosed, because suddenly jigsaw pieces floated into place for dad or for mum. Your child's difficulties at school, your child's difficulties adjusting, difficulties growing up were more than mere adolescence. And you knew this. And because the world has moved on, you received a diagnosis. And when you received a diagnosis, when you looked at the checklist, you thought, my God, that's me. So what difference does a diagnosis make? 0345 6060 973. And the second question is one that I don't know what qualifications you will need to answer. But shall we talk through why lockdown and school closures will have caused more problems, will have created more problems? It's all about brain development, isn't it? It's why we have the phrase formative years. And if you are denied socializing during your formative years. The year that transitioned to secondary school in the middle of lockdown is probably the hardest hit by this, because unless you were coming up from primary school with loads of your own classmates, you sort of have the combination of a new and alien social group and not being there. So all sorts of reasons why lockdown and school closures will have exacerbated problems like I don't know. I don't have the expertise to know whether ADHD is pure brain chemistry or whether nurture can play a role in it. But I don't know how helpful headlines that contain the word disability are either. One child in 9 has a disability after a post-pandemic surge driven by mental health conditions such as ADHD. Talking about 1.6 million children. Disabled is a word. Differently abled, perhaps, is more helpful. And then the Times goes on to list all the money that it's costing, and that, of course, is often the bedrock of the othering, the search for a target. And would you have thought that if you found yourself nodding along to some blowhard banging on about refugees or Brexit, and I'd said to you, give it a few years, and she'll be going after children with learning difficulties, you probably would have said, oh, come off it, James. No, they wouldn't. But you should have learnt by now that these predictions I make rarely go awry. 18 minutes after 12 is the time. What does a diagnosis mean? 0345 606 0973. And what relationship might there be between lockdown and mental health? Here is a superb point from Kate in Surrey. I completely missed this, Kate, and I've got no idea who you might be talking about specifically, but my goodness me, this is a powerful point. Isn't it fascinating that people who were surprisingly very concerned about children's mental health during lockdown, as a reason why we should end lockdown and stop people working from home, are exactly the same people who dismiss completely children's mental health issues when the agenda and the narrative has moved on again? I think you might be right. Get them back to school now. Get back to work. Stop working from home. It's going to be terrible for their mental health. Fast forward a few years. Mental health problems among children have risen exponentially, and it's all a load of cotton wool indulging of kids that we would once have just called naughty. It's almost as if the people Kate describes are enormous hypocrites.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
This is a common message that I think is worth sharing from Benji. Literally all of my mates who were, quotes, naughty at school, end quotes, in the 70s and 80s now have some sort of diagnosis, ranging from dyslexia to ADHD and even bipolar. So the question of why has there been an increase in diagnoses is partly unhelpful, because science has improved. It would be a bit like saying, why have we got more people now surviving cancer? It's because the science has improved. We've got chemotherapy. We've got treatments. We didn't have people surviving cancer in my day. They all dropped dead. Yeah, I know, but that's what medicine does. It constantly expands and encompasses more and more understanding of conditions and therefore treatments, because to treat something, first you need to identify it. So there's the question, what difference does a diagnosis make? And just in layman's terms, unless you are an expert, why would lockdown and school closures have had such a profound effect apparently had such a profound effect on the mental health of young people? Sam's in Colchester. Sam, what would you like to say?
Hello, I am a father of 2 children with ADHD, one of which has ASD as well. As for why a diagnosis can help, well, actually it's about understanding the requirements of that child. So I was diagnosed myself later in life with combined type ADHD. My eldest son has ASD and combined type ADHD, and my youngest son has attentive ADHD quite high.
Okay.
Now, the differences between the different types are all quite large as well. Now, in terms of how it helped them in school, so my oldest, who is now 16 and doing quite well, getting ready for his GCSEs,
right,
was diagnosed in around year 3 or year 4. And they even, by his diagnosis, it meant that the school could give him more time and start to understand him in a different way.
Yes.
And tailor his needs in the classroom differently. Now, this can be anything down to, and I'll use the chair as an example, which I said to the researcher on the phone. He had a specific chair, and the texture was important.
Right.
Because if he sat on a different chair with the wrong texture, it irritated his skin. or it caused his skin to feel uncomfortable. So he'd then get up more, he'd then walk around more, he'd then be disruptive more. And the diagnosis has been really important for all of the children to kind of understand the causes for why they act, not necessarily just the naughty kid. And I was the naughty kid. I had that label myself, so I know what that's like.
It never leaves you, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Even after
and I was diagnosed last year.
Yeah, there you go. I'm sorry for what you went through, and I think it's more than naughty, isn't it? You're not just the naughty kid. You're the worthless kid. You're the kid who's never going to amount to anything. You're the kid who's dragging everybody else down. They're not laughing with you. They're laughing at you, kid. Some of it is really gross, really horrible. It's odd, isn't it? We think of our society as being very nurturing and welcoming of children, but stories like this remind us that it's very much a work in progress. What has the school been like? How does the school accommodate these?
The primary school was for both of the children, was probably better than the secondary school. And I think that's because as you go into secondary school, you've got all of the teenage hormones, which then go active with everything as well.
Yeah, that's true.
And unfortunately, when you go into secondary schools, a lot of the time, because both my children are fortunate enough to still be able to attend mainstream schools, so they're not in special schools. However, what that does mean is more often than not, I mean, with ADHD, one of the most common things with the hyperactivity side of it is the inability to think before you speak. And it's all well and good telling someone, well, make sure you think before you speak, and that's even later in life. But you wouldn't tell someone with crutches to put the crutches down and walk upstairs.
Such a good point. It's such a good point.
And
you might help them get better.
unfortunately-
You might help them get better crutches, or build them or build them
Exactly
a stair
that.
lift. But you wouldn't just tell them to put the crutches away and start hopping around.
No. And the secondary schoolers then, they find generally that it's easier to remove the children with the disabilities and the extra requirements from the situation itself, rather than putting in those extra barriers around it.
Yes,
and that's the disappointing thing in secondary school. And I understand the struggles that schools have.
Well, yeah, I was
There's
going to
never
say,
enough budget.
born partly of necessity, but also partly of resource, isn't it? It's another consequence of austerity. And the fear must be for parents like you that things are going to get worse, because the coverage of this story is very much, the pound signs are spinning as I read every paragraph. Say that again?
It's the article itself and even the headlines on it have definitely rolled me up.
Yeah, because it is A, sowing that seed of scepticism, and B, making it a financial issue rather than a healthcare issue. As you say, if the children were hobbling around on crutches, no one would start complaining. Well, some people would, but most people who might be minded to complain about this or be performatively sceptical about this would not do so with physical injuries. Number of broken bones being diagnosed went through the roof after X-rays were invented. You know, but that means that back in my day we just called it limping. Thank you, Sam. I'm going to crack on. There are a few other things I'd like to ask you, but I've got loads of calls and I want to try and get as many involved as possible. Also some incredibly powerful texts to read out. I took a breakdown in years of stress at work for me to seek help, James, and I was diagnosed in 2008 with adult ADD. It nearly destroyed me, and I still want to cry sometimes, writes Neil. Nick's in St Albans. Nick, what would you like to say?
So I come in from the side where I was initially very much like you with ADHD, thinking, is it really a real thing? But
this is for anyone tuning in. This is a very long time ago in my case.
And for me, it was about, well, funnily enough, so I was diagnosed with ADHD myself about 5 years ago.
Okay.
And this was after a lifetime of being diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, depression, a phobia, pretty much everything. And at school, I was put into in secondary school, a special class because they thought I had dyslexia.
Right.
Turns out I just was not paying enough attention.
This is a terrible thing for a kid to be processing, isn't it? A constant barrage of I don't know quite what the word is. Burdens is the word I'm looking for.
It was embarrassing as well, because I thought I can read the words. I just often misread them.
Right.
But it was decent, and it was only when one of the psychiatrists said, you know what, I think we should explore an ADHD diagnosis. And I said, is that a real thing? In my naivety, despite everything else. And I went through the process, and the first day I took stimulant medication, which is the first line of treatment, certainly for adults and children over a certain age. It was like, it had a profound impact on me, because for the first time ever, my brain, I didn't realise how noisy my brain actually was. It never stopped. It explained why the child I wasn't unable to sleep, why I would fall asleep at 2 a.m. and wake up at 7 a.m. before everyone else.
Yeah.
And it's also impacted me in the way that I have a 5-year-old daughter who, about 3.5 years old, me and my wife started to think she may be exhibiting symptoms of it. And in her preschool, she's in reception now, within the first few months, the school referred her to SENCO, which is special educational needs, because they said that she exhibits all of the symptoms of ADHD. And, understanding the condition and having it myself, and actually seeing the discomfort that it causes for her, and her not being able to understand, seeing a child who's incapable of not doing something and she doesn't know why she has to do that thing, or being exhausted but saying, I can't sleep, I'm wide awake. And at school, the school have been amazing. We're very lucky there. They've given her own drawer with fidget toys that she can go to anytime she wants. She gets to sit in a different place in the class where she's close to the teacher.
And this is better for the teacher, for everyone in the class, and crucially for your daughter.
Well, this is I think, so important, is that she is growing up, and I hope it's going to be the case for more children and all children going forward, to grow up understanding that being different isn't necessarily a bad thing, and that she's going to get the support so that it doesn't, I hope, impact her so profoundly as many people who got diagnosed as adults who were told that they were not trying hard enough.
Because it's a curious combination of relief and regret, I imagine, Nick. Relief that you understand it now, and regret, I mean, better late than never plays a part, but regret that you didn't understand it and that the people around you didn't understand it sooner.
It's you know what, I look back at so many moments in my life and I think, God, if I'd have had the understanding, or how it could have changed, and it's helped the people around me, my wife, my family, understand things in a much better way as well.
Do you ever talk to him? To little Nick?
You know what? Yes, I do.
Good.
It's going back in, but unfortunately, it's still almost in a very negative way. I don't say, "Oh, you know what? It's okay, mate."
That's what you need to do. That's what you need to do. Tell him he's all right. Tell him it's not his fault.
I need to move away from the regret of not knowing, and the understanding that I didn't know, but it makes sense now. And it was a light bulb moment that first day when I took that medication with all the other stuff I'd taken and nothing ever worked. I was always told, you're not trying hard enough to get better with my obsessive compulsive disorder, they said, and all of this. And I was like, I'm trying, but it just doesn't make sense to me.
Because that wasn't what you had. I hear you. A lot of people do. My therapist said to me, tell him that you will look after him now. And that was one of the most profound moments of my life.
It's helped me be a lot kinder to myself nowadays, going forward, tremendously, because I didn't understand why I did things and I could not control it. And we are told that if you can't control it, it's lack of self-control, and that makes you a bad person.
We just called it naughty. We just called it naughty in my day. Nick, it made me late for the news. You understand why I have to crack on. Gosh, good luck, mate. And thank you. Amelia Cox, how's your headlines?
In the last few minutes, the Attorney General...
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:36. Hi, James. I am the mother of 2 children, aged 6 and 4, who have suspected ADHD, and the wife of a 29-year-old who was diagnosed with moderate ADHD yesterday. For us, a diagnosis means validation. It means our children aren't just naughty or violent. They are hard work for a reason. It means I'm not a terrible mother for being so overwhelmed that I thought about abandoning my children during the pandemic. It means I'm not awful for not enjoying motherhood as much as others. It also means that we can put things in place. My oldest competes in dancing. Since her diagnosis, we can put things in place to make those days easier. And I can stand by a sideline and watch my incredible autistic ADHD daughter win first place, because we practice differently and we face classes differently. For my 4-year-old, we face potty training differently. For my husband, it means I face our household finances differently. Without these diagnoses, I couldn't have got into the workshops to help them, and my daughters would be behind even further. That's from Kerry, and it's of a piece with an awful lot of messages that I am getting. I'm battling the loss and grief caused by a diagnosis of ADHD at 42 years old, James. Every day something happens that prompts the thought, if only I had known earlier the depression, the acting out, the intense boredom, the crippling procrastination, the sleep problems, the exhaustion, the inability to control anything, as well as the overwhelming thought that I did not and would never fit in. There was a simple clinical reason for it all, but it was hidden because my parents didn't want to face the shame of a divergent child. I can't get the time back, but I can advocate for a world that's not built or equipped to cater for those outside of the neurotypical framework, including my own kids. Gosh, you got me there with that last line. It's my turn to fight for them, says Peter. Jeff's in Eltham. Jeff, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. This has really struck a chord with me, this phone-in. Appreciate it. So basically, I was late diagnosed at the age of 45.
Gosh.
By accident.
What, you just... How do you accidentally get that? Go on, tell me more.
No. Right. So I'll give you a snapshot of my life in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
At school, I was very hyperactive, cleaning my bedroom till 2 o'clock in the morning, etc., etc. If you think of your brain as a television and somebody else has got a remote control, that's the best way I can describe ADHD.
Gosh, that's a great way of describing it.
So, yeah, I could never focus on one thing 100% because my brain would just change channels. And I'm like, especially in conversation, I'll be flitting from one thing to the next. My friends are going, why are you talking about that? And then I'm losing friends because I'm not normal. So anyway, fast forward, I'm very high functioning. I'm a high bracket taxpayer. I lose jobs every 2 to 3 years,
really?
And I go back on the market because people don't understand. I sit in meetings, I know the answer.
Yeah.
I have to wait an hour to let everybody else talk about the answer,
right?
Until I give what the answer is at the end, and it generally is right. And that is not boasting.
No,
that is just it's looking into we can do that. I hyper focus for up to 14 hours without food or drink on a subject that interests me. So I get really good at it, and when I'm really good at it, I don't care about it anymore.
Enough. Finished.
Yeah. So anyway, after all of this and failed relationships and failed friendships, I just thought there was something inherently broken with myself. I was lucky enough to have Bupa with a company that I had. I went to see a psychiatrist. I said, look, I think I'm depressed.
Okay.
And I spent three months with him, and he said to me at the end of it, I'd like you to do some tests, actually. Okay. And we've done the tests, and he goes, by the way, you've got PTSD because of all what's happened before. I'm on the autistic spectrum, which says a lot for me because I'm in engineering, and STEM fields is quite good for people with ASD. And you've got ADHD. Ding, 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 ding. All makes sense. Yeah.
And how did you feel?
I felt relieved. I felt relieved that I'm not normal.
Yeah. What do we say to that person? You might be able to help here, who feels constant regret at not having done it sooner? Because I'm not, as far as I'm aware, neurodivergent, but I certainly benefited enormously from therapy. And then I came out of it thinking, God, I wish I'd done this years ago. And I said that to my therapist, and she was brilliant. And she said, well, yeah, okay, that would have been great, but why can't you just be grateful that you've done it now? And that really worked for me. So you're describing relief, whereas the text I read out just before you came on was describing a constant cycle of regret at all of the things that would have gone differently in life if it had been diagnosed earlier. How do we bridge that gap, do you think?
It's education. At the moment, if you look at, I believe school teachers have an optional half-day course on ADHD, might have changed now, and neurodivergent people.
Knowledge.
Absolutely. And also the NHS. Because I'm no longer in a job that gives me Bupa or healthcare, private health. I'm on a 4-year waiting list to get remedicated.
Gosh.
Which is, people talk about the bandwagon and everybody jumping onto it. I don't think they are.
Not many people do, mate, and the ones that do are idiots.
I think people are waking up and going, okay, maybe it's not naughty, maybe there is something else. And I think go back 400 years, we would have been the people bringing back the meat because we'd have gone that extra mile and getting all the women in the tribe. Now it's not normal.
So it's an evolutionary explanation, actually, that you provided. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah. So societies past, this would have been like a superpower. And in fact, I don't know if you've read. No, well, I was about to say there's an astonishing series of books, the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan, which takes neurodivergency. It almost does what you just did, except applying it not to 400 years ago, but applying it to the pantheon of Greek gods, of ancient gods, and the demigods living in the modern world present as being neurodivergent, which is, I mean, I'm not explaining it very well, but I don't know, it certainly would be good for children with any of these conditions to read if they haven't already, and quite possibly adults as well. Jeff, I'm cracking on because I want to squeeze in more people, and to your point about the penny dropping for people and the sheer scale of people ringing me now is extraordinary, even by our standards. And I mean, I'll give you one really good example. This man is telling my life story. Talking about Jeff, the number of people who are just hearing echoes of their own experiences and their own lives is truly extraordinary. I'd stress one thing, because I really do think it's important, and Dom has sent this. He said, being able to talk to our inner child is a huge part of the process. And thank you, James, for showing that compassion, because like so many others, the journey to my embracing of my ADHD has stemmed from my children's diagnoses. I now work with parents of ADHD and autistic children, making a difference to how a love-based response is the way to support children and adults alike, rather than responses rooted in fear. It's so important. And of course, the very, very, very first thing that you can do is recognise what a diagnosis means. And it doesn't mean that you need to pull your socks up or work harder or give your head a wobble. I can't remember whether this applied to dyslexia. I've got a horrible feeling it did, but I think, stroke hope, I'm too young to have joined in. I've had some very moving messages from friends of mine, actually, who I didn't even know were listening to the programme. Gary says, I was called backwards at school, James. I was poked when I was reading, I was laughed at in spelling tests and made to stand in front of the class. Dyslexia wasn't recognised in the 60s and 70s. Bloody awful it was. I think that was, well, we didn't call it dyslexia in my day, we just called it being slow. We just called it being stupid. That's what you're doing now. If you're taking the same approach to it, we didn't have dyslexia in my day. Why are there so many diagnoses of it? There weren't any when I was at school. Yeah, you didn't know what it was, mate. I mean, for God's sake, what do you need? A diagram?
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the news that 1 in 9 children now have diagnoses for mental health conditions such as ADHD being presented in some quarters as a terrible drain upon the economy. It's actually wonderful news. It's incredible, isn't it, how the same story can prompt two responses, one of which is cruel and unthinking, and one of which is honest and uplifting. It's wonderful news. It means that the next generation of people with ADHD and other conditions will not be pilloried. They're still going to have some struggles and some fights that you wouldn't have had otherwise. But my God, the difference a diagnosis makes. And if you've missed this, then you can rewind on Global Player and listen to just some of the countless stories that are coming in to the studio. Peter is in Stockport. Peter, what can you tell us?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
I was diagnosed just before Christmas.
Okay.
And I'm 42. And it's been a light bulb moment, but it's been very, very emotional.
Yes.
I'm in mourning at the moment for my previous 20 years of what I would feel as like inadvertent failure in myself.
Oh.
I had a school teacher, for example. I mean, there's plenty of school teachers, examples I can think of, but one, every time I saw him in the corridor, he used to just sing, "Things can only get better."
Right.
And you just get this sense of self-worthlessness for things that are out of your control.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things that I'd like to sort of say. First of all, is that Global Play, you've got an amazing podcast called You're Wrong About ADHD.
Right.
So
well, actually, I say that again. Whose podcast?
You're wrong about ADHD. It's on the Global Player.
Yeah, no, it's Katie and Sam Pittis and Katie Brethwick. I've just written down a note reminding me to push people towards that when we get towards the end of the programme. But you've read my mind, Peter. So you're wrong about ADHD. On it's a global podcast presented by my Classic FM colleagues, former LBC colleagues, Katie Brethwick and Sam Pittis. It's had an extraordinary response. They're doing amazing work, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, it penetrates so many different parts of your life. There's the main symptoms that everybody's aware of. There's things like impulsivity. That can lead to things like bad with money or alcohol things. If you want to switch off your mind, you might take drugs and things like that. It's a real roller coaster. And it's the weirdest thing because you can think of things and you can be intelligent and you can make connections that other people might not be able to make.
Yes.
But then you can forget what you're supposed to be doing for, a particular task, or somebody says, can you just help me with this? And everything else that you were thinking about goes out the window. You go and help somebody, and then the things that you need to get done pile up, and then you get in this cycle of self-loathing, really. The funny thing is, going a bit highbrow now, but I've been reading Seneca's letters.
Yeah.
And I think his letter 2 and letter 3 really talk about ADHD. It's something along the lines of, the sign of a restless mind is not of industry, it's a sign of sick mind. I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but it's sort of like those things all the time where it's like you're flitting from one book to another subject, or, you're just constantly buzzing all the time. It just doesn't stop. And
it's nothing new. I mean, Seneca was writing when? For a couple of hundred years BC?
Yeah.
So it's the idea that it's new, it's suddenly come out of nowhere. It's as daft as suggesting that, it'd be a bit like saying, God, where's all this COVID come from? We didn't have any COVID. I mean, we just discover things, don't we? We understand things better than we used to.
And it's something. I mean, there's so much information out there. It's quite overwhelming for somebody, but where they can't even deal with regular information streams. But it's something to do with the dopamine and the fact that there can be medication that can almost like a light bulb get it into control.
Why the morning? Why? I think a lot of people are talking to me about mourning, and I think you're encouraged under some treatments to mourn, aren't you? To sort of make peace with the past, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, had somebody had it in the 60s, it would, do you know what I mean, or hundreds of years. There's no treatment around, or there's the wrong treatments, or misdiagnosed, or you've got anxiety, or you just take antidepressants.
Yeah, and misdiagnosed, and they're mistreated, and antidepressants can have a deleterious effect on some patients when they can be, of course, life-changing for others. But you wouldn't want that in this case. Peter, thank you. I'm cracking on only because there's so many people. So many people. I'm 68. You just said, I don't know what it would be like if you were in your 60s. Mark texted while you were talking. I'm 68, and this guy has just described my entire life. The NHS was no help whatsoever, and so-called friends over the years just cast you aside, and that leads to an ongoing traumatic, lonely and depressive life. My story, seeing my mother being taken away to psychiatric hospital in my teens, and a drunk stepping in front of my motorcycle when I was 20. Failed relationships. I lost my daughter to murder. Everywhere I go, people don't like me. Either I pray to go to sleep every night. And, there's a really extreme example of what happens when you live with this condition without really knowing what is going on. Christian's in Twickenham. Christian, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Lovely to speak to you.
Likewise,
absolutely the right subject for me. And also what you're saying about hugging that you were in a child. I saw a lovely psychiatrist that helped me with that. And yes, I can't recommend that enough.
Huge.
Life-changing. Yeah, absolutely, unequivocally. So basically, I was listening to the radio and you've described what's been happening with myself and my family.
Gosh.
Our school were brilliant. They mentioned to us that our little boy might be neurodivergent. So we actually went private because it's quite a wait, and we thought we don't want to wait 2 years for him to get the help he needs, and it can be a wait of 2 years. So we went private. The diagnosis came back with ADHD, dyslexia and dyspraxia. So the poor little boy couldn't sit still long enough to make sense of any of the words.
Yeah.
And it's been game-changing because the school now, he's when he glazes over a bit and it's too much, they go, right, go and do a run the block outside, or 5-star jumps, and he's such a good little boy. You've actually met him. We bumped into you in Chiswick once, and you're one of my heroes. So you kindly stopped for a photo with us and him, and you chatted to him, and he's an amazing little boy. and it's really helping him, the diagnosis. Lockdown was awful because we didn't know. We were trying to help him learn, and he was in tears, and what should have taken 10 minutes was an hour, and all of us pulling our hair out going, we've actually got a daughter we need to look after. And it was actually horrific, and
so nobody's fault, least of all his. Just
the knowledge now is just incredible, and since learning about it, my wife read up on it and then went, okay, this comes often it's in genetic. She then worked out with me, it's a thing. While listening to your show, someone rang in with Mystery Hour, and you asked them, how do you know that? And they said something to do with sound. They can't tune sound out. I don't know if you remember.
I do vaguely.
And I was like, ding, that rang the bell with me. Wow. That's me. So now I can just say to a friend, will say, listen, I'm having beers down the pub, my birthday down the pub. And I'll say, I'll make excuses because I can't go there and listen to all the sounds and try and concentrate. It's tiring. And I now know that that's why, because I can't tune out all the sounds. So I have to look at people's mouths to try to listen to what they're saying. And
I understand.
It's exhausting.
Of course it's exhausting. And it also doesn't make sense to anybody else except you until you understand it and can therefore explain it. Do you know the word I'm taking away from this whole hour is actually liberating? It's so every story is a tale of liberation, isn't it?
Well, I went through the morning, though. I was angry because all my wasted time and beating myself up, and I was when my wife met me, I was in a dark place, and I've seen some great counsellors, and then this sort of set me back because I was like, oh my God, that happened when I was at university, walking to the corridor, bursting into tears because I was overwhelmed because I'd go into the workshop to make a small light, I was doing product design thing, and I came out of the workshop with a 6 foot tall light that twisted and had gel in it, the hair gel because of the bubbles, and then my teachers were going, great, but and I'm like, yeah, well, I don't know. So that's been game changing for me, and I feel so blessed for my son because
it's going to be easier, and that's why halfway through this hour I suddenly realised that this headline is it's not just misinterpretation of the headline that we need to address and undo. It's recognition that this is actually brilliant news. More and more people being diagnosed with things that were not previously diagnosed. All these parents knowing that their children are going to be spared some of the unhappiness and misery they endured because their condition is now understood. It's named and understood. Christian, thank you. Give my love to your boy. I always try and that's why, you see. Imagine if I'd been rude to him when he stopped me in the street and he'd be on the phone. Actually, James, you were really rude to me when I stopped you outside Poundland on Chiswick High Road. Thank you, mate. Stay safe. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com.
James O'Brien on LBC.